welcome to the future and a revolution in sound.
A sound beam that works like a spotlight. It focuses sound only on the people who want to hear it. Could it mean an end to noise pollution?
First, a new device which could transform the way in which we experience sound. Normal sound from a voice or a speaker is like the light from a bulb. Switch it on and it radiates everywhere. Just like when I shout to Philippa over there, everyone can hear me.
But an astonishing new technique from America makes sound travel in a totally different way. Less like a lamp and more like a torch or a spotlight. Well, Anya Sitaram has been in Boston hearing all about it.
Pretty good, eh? Well, it's not that I can't find the beat, it's I can't hear it at all. In fact, the only people who can hear the music are the dancers themselves. That's because they're standing in their own personal sound beam, pointed at them just like a beam of light. If I stand here, I can hardly hear the music, but if I go just here, it's really clear. Now, we're used to the idea that loud sound spreads uncontrollably, but for the first time, we're directing the exact location of the sound. The audio spotlight is the most revolutionary way to generate sound since the loudspeaker, and it's being developed here at the MIT...
Anya, could you come upstairs?
Hi, is that Joe? I'm on my way. Hi, Joe.
Hi.
Apart from trying to startle me downstairs, what's the point of all of this?
Well, the idea is that rather than filling a room with sound, you can put sound only where you want it.
So how does this differ from the loudspeaker on my stereo system?
Well, the loudspeaker on your stereo makes sound that spreads very quickly, filling a room with sound. This, in contrast, makes a very narrow beam of sound that you can shine like a light.
Normal sound is rather like a light bulb flooding a room. What Joe has done is extraordinary, making sound that's more like a spotlight. He makes use of high-frequency ultrasound waves beyond our hearing, which travel in straight lines. The ultrasound transmits audible sound in a long, thin beam, which can project the sound up to 200 meters.
Occasionally I'll whisper in someone's ear from several stories up. Or when we have meetings and functions down in our lobby, we have caterers walking around with dishes in their arms, so I'll make smashing glass sounds appear by their feet, and they look around like there's something dropped.
To show just how directional it is, we're testing out the audio spotlight in this large space. Now, because you can't actually see a sound beam, we've attached a laser pointer to the audio spotlight, and as it moves across the wall, that's exactly where the sound beam is hitting. So in a minute now, I'm going to move it across the wall and past the camera, so you should be able to hear the music or Mozart really loudly at home. So wait for it. It sounds tinny compared to normal hi-fi quality sound because Joe is still perfecting the bass. The beam is extremely narrow, just half a metre wide. Joe first had the idea for the audio spotlight when he was just a student.
Well, I had been a loudspeaker engineer since high school, and I was always very frustrated with the inability of a loudspeaker to control where your sound was. So I had the idea of using interacting ultrasound beams.
What Joe does first is combine the music with ultrasound. This recreates the complex wave patterns of the music at a much higher frequency that can't be heard. He uses a specially designed speaker to send out this high-frequency ultrasound beam. Physical properties of the air then distort the beam, producing a range of frequencies, including audible sound. Because Joe knows exactly how much distortion the air causes, he can predict how to combine the music with the ultrasound to get the music out again. The possibilities for its applications are almost endless.
So, for example, in a museum, If you're standing in front of a painting, you may want to hear something about that painting, but you don't want to have to disturb people who are standing at other paintings.
The sound beam can't cover very long distances yet, but once perfected, it could be used to pick out just one person in the crowd, a personal message system in public places like airports and stations, or even a personal speaker for music.
Maybe someday we'll be able to travel on the plane without having to use headphones. You already have your own personal light source and your own personal air source. Why not your own personal sound source right above your head?
If the audio spotlight catches on, it could transform everyday life, bringing peace and quiet to otherwise noisy places. But sometimes we don't always want that. Joe, over here!
Well, if you want to have your own private party, the Audio Spotlight could be beaming sound direct to you too in the next couple of years. And for a closer look at how it works, you should visit the Tomorrow's World website. The address is www.bbc.co.uk/TW. That address is also at the end of the show.
You go back to 1972 and you look in the congressional records, and I think it was in the middle of the year, there was Army representatives giving testimony in front of a congressional committee stating that there can be mind control waves that can piggyback human brain waves, and people think it's coming from their own thoughts, but they can be controlled. Yeah. And they said that that was back in 1972, in the beginning of the Montauk Project, and they were saying how vital that would be for national security. So that's 37 years ago, and that was being discussed.
Right, and that's from the ELF.
And they knew that even back then, and so you can just imagine what they've done since that time.
That's right. That's right. And I told you about the time down in Lower Manhattan. There was a billboard, and it had like a speaker on top of it, and there was a billboard for some paranormal show that was on cable. And when you walked by it, all of a sudden you heard a voice in your head going, "Turn around, turn around. Do you believe? Do you believe?" And you see all these people in the street just freaking out, you know, and this billboard was advertising in their heads.
I had to get my girls to have a look.
It's not your imagination. What's that? Who's there? It's not your imagination. What's that? Who's there?
This is silent sound. Subliminal mind control. This is how it works. very simply broken down. In step 1, the unit on the top produces a steady tone near the high end of the hearing range, say about 15,000 hertz. In step 2, which is the same part of step 1, the hypnotist's voice, ranging from say 300 hertz to 4,000 hertz, is injected with microphone. In 3, you see the steady tone at 15,000 hertz, accompanied by the hypnotist's voice from 300 hertz to 4,000 hertz, passes into a frequency modulator. The hypnotist's voice controls the frequency. Here in 4, you see the output from the frequency modulator, which is that steady tone coupled with the hypnotist's voice, pass through the frequency modulator. Now you have an output that is more or less a steady tone. That's like tinnitus, ringing in the ears, but only with hypnosis embedded. And you see the curve below is magnified to show how the FM frequency modulated voice controls the timing of the transmitter's pulses. Here in 5, you see the transmitter itself. Each vertical line is one short pulse of microwave signal at a frequency to which the human brain is sensitive. Then the brain converts the train of microwave pulses back to an inaudible voice. Timing of each microwave pulse is controlled by each downslope crossing of the voice. That is Sharp's original 1974 method. Here in 6, you see the total output of the system going into your brain. And note, there is no conscious defense possible against this silent sound hypnosis. This was doable in 1974. This is just the tip of the iceberg of what's being done to people in the United States and in other countries. The United States is the biggest offender, the biggest perpetrator of this evil mind control technology. Google it for yourself. Now I want to give thanks to Eleanor White for all her work over the years exposing this evil technology. For more information, check out my video, Silent Sound Weapon in Organized Stalking of U.S. Citizens with DEWs, Directed Energy Weapons. And there's no better source than Raven1.net for information on this evil technology. That's Eleanor White's website. There's a lot of information there on a lot of threats to we the people related to these evil technologies that have been developed by our government since 1947. This
going to be talking about. We call them the brain frequency bands. What that means is that the brain operates and emits electrical impulses that fall into cycles per second. And when they fall within a certain range or a band, they're labeled with a certain name. For example, when the brain is functioning, they say this is brain output, or emissions or electrical emissions. When the brain is functioning with very fast emissions of electricity, then those emissions fall into cycles per second, as I said, and when they are anywhere between 14 to about 20 cycles per second, let's say, we call that beta brain activity, a beta brain function. And this right here is what we say is more associated with the physical world, or physical functioning. This is what we say deals with the world of action. This is where you use your physical senses to get information that then you can utilize and apply towards problem solving, towards moving around effectively in this physical environment, towards making good choices and decisions, whatever it is. So we gather information through a lifetime that we then learn how to discern and utilize effectively for for applying it in our everyday living experience. So beta is associated with the physical world, the world of action, and incorporates the physical senses in order to gather information to be applied for and you close your eyes. Now this is a natural function for everybody because everybody must go through alpha to go to sleep every single day of their lives, or every time you take a nap, for instance. You must go through alpha to get into deep sleep. That's a natural function of the brain, so everybody does this already. 7 cycles per second or emissions of electricity per second to about 14 cycles per second. This is what we call the alpha band of functioning. And in this particular way of functioning, you have a very dynamic mind. It's dynamic mind. It's considered more the mind together with here, you know, this area here can be considered the world of thought. So you can say thought. The quality of thought is a little bit different when you're doing it from here or here, but you do a lot of thinking in both these dimensions. You generate thought, and so it's a very conscious thought. So this is a dynamic mind that incorporates visualization and imagination. Now these are 2 qualities of genius function because it takes visualization and imagination to enhance creativity, and it takes creativity to enhance the genius function ability. So everybody has a potential of being a genius. And the more you learn how to use your creativity and your visualization and imagination, the closer you are to being more of things. You deduce, if I do this and this, well, this could lead to this. Well, if I have this challenge or this problem, and I think about what could be possible outcomes or solutions, well, I could have this solution or that solution, I can talk to this person, and very creatively you may come up with 5, 6 different outcomes. Maybe here you have 6 or 7, here maybe you have 1 or 2, because you're more creative in the alpha frequency. That one of the best ways to slow down your brain frequency and go into the alpha dimension is to close your eyes. And I say that because you eliminate 85% of the external stimulus that comes in from the environment because it comes in through your eyes. So the moment you close your eyes, your brain doesn't have to work so hard. And it's a proven fact that the only physical sense that requires high beta frequencies to operate it is the focused sense of sight. So when you defocus your vision or your eyesight, like when you're daydreaming and you're not thinking of, or you're not seeing anything directly here. In fact, you're actually focusing on the pictures in your mind. Here, you don't generate thoughts, but you may have visions, dreamlike experiences. You might hear sounds. You might have insights. You do. Your frequency goes up, and from alpha you say, wow, what was that? What did I just experience? What dream was that? I just had a little dream. Oh wow, I just heard something. And your brain frequency automatically picks up, and from here you evaluate. With dynamic mind, you deduce and evaluate, access the information that you experience, that creatures in this planet that function with biological intelligence that don't have the deducing factors, such as your pets or other animals or creatures in this planet, have biological intelligence, which is more of your way of your body functioning, innate intelligence, so to speak. So biological intelligence seems to reside here. So the thinking is inductive. You are impressed with information, but you can't access it or deduce it or think about it or ponder on it. Your frequency will automatically come up to alpha when you do that. But here, it's really important for the healing process, and that your brain person is entering sleep. And mind you, every time you enter sleep, you're going to go through this whole cycle of slowing down your brain frequencies, spending time in slow wave sleep, and then frequencies begin to pick up into what we call rapid eye movement. Rapid eye movement is anywhere around 14 to 16 cycles per second, and your most vivid dreaming takes place there. And then what happens after that is that your frequency of brain slows down again to slow wave sleep, and you spend about 90 minutes in slow wave sleep before your frequency picks up again, and you have another session of rapid eye movement. Now, these periods of rapid eye movement are progressively getting greater and greater in length. It can be 5 minutes the first time, 10 minutes the second time, 15 minutes the third time,
And they took one of my inventions and put it under secrecy for years because some of the technologies I've developed can be used for mind control. And, you know, it's Iblis fair seeming. All the TV shows and movies program people. The technology is reinforced, so we're getting it subconsciously and we're getting it consciously on multi-levels. The TV sets, scan rates, and, you know, are designed to put people into, you know, alpha states or below and hypnotic trance. And then they've got the modulations coming from the Wi-Fi towers and the modulations coming in through subliminal programming on the TV sets, and then also through the power lines.
Now, the idea that the human mind is an electronic organism, an electronic machine, is certainly not what most people envision. They think we're chemical first, what we eat is crucial and all that. It is crucial, but we're electrical first and chemical second. And they, being the scientists who are behind this effort to control people, have decoded much, if not all, of the valuable parts of the human emotion spectrum. The emotional spectrum is known in terms of hertz, megahertz, and other kinds of electromagnetic radiation and frequencies, and can be programmed. We know that people who go near secure military installations will all of a sudden become very nervous and frightened and want to leave. They want to get the hell out of there. And that's because the frequency for fear is being broadcast on a perimeter basis all around that facility. This is really older technology. It's not new. Now, what Pat just said is critical. We all know about cell phone towers. We know about the Gwen towers. We know about satellite applications of electromagnetic fields. We know about the HARP program to pump up into the ionosphere tremendous amounts of electronic energy and then use that to beam back down specific and selected frequencies which can affect small groups or large groups of peoples and populations. But there's another main platform, a main venue, that these kinds of frequencies are actually placed into the human mind at very close range, and it's called the power grid. And Pat was the first one that I ever knew to figure it out. So tell us that story about how those nice, friendly 60 hertz wires in your walls and your 60 hertz powered electronic devices in your home can have a dual purpose at the very least.
John Lilly developed technologies for bypassing the mechanisms of the human brain that resist programming. My friend Adam Trombley was also a friend of John Lilly's, and he was in Hawaii looking at the power grid, and there are signals coming in the power grid that have some ultrasonic waveforms and certain wave shape, and so Adam was looking at this grid on the power line, and Lilly walked into to Adam Trombley's house, and Adam Trombley had the waveform up on the screen.
I see.
And John said to Adam, he said, "Oh, you know about my waveform?" And Adam said, "What are you talking about?" And then Adam said, "No, this is coming in on a power grid." And then John Lilly said, "Oh, so that's what they're doing with my waveform, the Lilly wave." And if you Google the Lilly wave, you'll find it's a waveform that enables you to bypass the resistance of the human mind and program the brain. And you can transmit fear, you can transmit any emotion, any kind of information you want on the Lilly wave. And basically, Adam had discovered that they're using it through the power grid, and subsequently I've been all over the country, all over the world, and measured these things, and apparently there are black boxes in the power companies that produce the Lilly wave, and they're associated with, Homeland Security or whatever. And basically, these devices put ultrasonic waveform pulses riding on top of the regular 60 hertz wave. And they are mind control waves, and they're coming into everybody's house.
So the Lilly wave basically disarms the brain's ability to discern and decide. It just puts it in a neutral state where things just flow right in, much like the flicker of the old TV set will do. First time you watch TV, it takes about 2 minutes to get into that altered state. It's not beta, it's down in the alpha, almost theta range. You become really a zombie, and then after the first time, it's a matter of seconds. The second time you watch television, you're taken right into that state where things can pour right into your subconscious mind. So the Lilly wave was used first to disarm the mind, and then your theory is, and Lilly's, and I'm sure Adam's as well, is that the Lilly wave was then piggybacked with any kind of known decoded electronic signature that would cause a reaction in the human brain and consciousness. Fascinating.
Well, that is correct, and we know the signatures for every emotional state. The signature of fear, the signature of bliss, the signature of anger. All of these signatures are very easy to duplicate, recreate, and you can, disarm with the Lilly wave. It goes right in, and then you put whatever you want in there, plus whatever subliminal programming you want. You can create unrest, you can create civil unrest, you can create riots, you can do anything you want.
And the amazing part about it is it can also disarm the brain to the extent that the other platforms, cell towers, the Gwen towers, HAARP, can also pump up and pump out any number of electronic frequencies that will then have a free ride and entree right into the human mind en masse. This is not just an isolated issue. It's an amazing thing to consider. We are under such control and influence that the average American, the sheep, will never figure it out. Here's a little piece on the Lilly wave and why it is the wave of choice, the waveform of choice. The goal was to find an electric current waveform with which animals, that can be us, could be stimulated through implanted electrodes for several hours per day for several months, without causing irreversible changes in the threshold by the passage of current through the tissue. All right? Many waveforms, including 60 cycles per second sine wave current, could apparently be used safely for these limited schedules of stimulation. They could not be used for the intensive long-term schedule of chronic stimulation. Electric current passed through the brain can cause at least two distinct types of injury, thermal and electrolytic. The technical problem in chronic brain stimulation, and they're using electrodes in this particular study I'm reading about, is to stay above the excitatory threshold and below the injury threshold in the neuronal system under consideration. This result can be achieved most easily by the proper choice of waveforms and their time courses, and less easily by the choice of the range of repetition frequencies and trained durations. So they worked on this and came up with this final statement. The previous waveforms used in neurophysiology and in neurosurgery injured the neurons when unidirectional current passed through the brain. Dr. Lilly developed a new electrical waveform to balance the current, first in one direction and then, after a brief interval, in the other. Thus, ions moving in the neurons would first be pushed one way and then quickly the other, stimulating the neurons and leaving the ions in their former positions within the neurons. This new waveform was called a balanced bidirectional pulse pair, or the Lilly wave. Now, what we're talking about here is the Lilly wave has been introduced and basically piggybacked on 60 hertz AC, which is in every home, every office, every building. And the idea is that it transmits it. We do know from an electronic reading of any 60 hertz power box with a simple EMF meter, you can pick up electromagnetic fields 5, 6, 7 feet away. So people who are living in a box, in a hamster cage, which is a bedroom, an office, a living room, are surrounded with this stuff. And if they send the Lilly wave in, piggybacked on top of it with other, well, we won't call them control, but we can call them influential frequencies, we have the perfect way to directly affect masses of people in their homes, offices, and other structures where they hang out. Pat, go ahead.
Well, that is correct, and it's used in multi-levels. It's used in microwaves also. Microwave stimulation of the brain. The problem with stimulating the brain continuously with microwave or control frequencies is that you can cause damage. You don't want to damage people's brain unless that's your intent.
But they're doing a good enough job on their own.
Yeah, but basically the idea is to stimulate, transmit the information in, return the nerves to their former state, and then the brain doesn't resist it, because if the same signal keeps coming in over time, the body can develop a defense against it. The Lilly wave is a waveform that prevents you from building any kind of defense.
Let's go into what happened at the beginning. There were several investigators right after apprehending him that came out and said that Nick told them that he heard voices in his head telling him exactly how to carry this out.
Sources tell ABC News the 19-year-old gunman told investigators he heard voices in his head directing him to conduct the attack.
The timing of the shooting was very interesting in that I had just released a different video that had an ex-military scientist talking about this very same voice-to-skull technology.
So the military can now put voices into people's heads. You can make people do things, and that's very easy. I could do it. I could do it to you in less than 3 days.
So such as assassins?
I could turn you into an assassin in less than 3 days.
So this led me to dig deeper. I first wanted to confirm, without a doubt, was this voice-to-skull technology real? And if so, how did it work? I soon learned that if the average American took the time to look at documents via the Freedom of Information Act and the Library of Congress and Patent Office, they would be horrified at what is openly admittedly being tested, tried, and written about in their very own country and on their very own fellow Americans.
Dr. Joseph Sharp and Alan Fry experimented with microwaves seeking to transmit spoken words directly into the audio cortex. Dr. Fry, a biophysicist at GE's Advanced Electronics Center, Cornell University, and a contractor for the Office of Naval Research, discovered in 1958 that the auditory system responds to electromagnetic energy and appeared to originate from within or near the back of the head. Fry's work in this field gave rise to the so-called Fry effect, which is now more commonly referred to as microwave hearing.
In ordinary sound perception, sound that goes into the ear canal gets amplified by the small bones in the middle ear and then gets to the inner ear where the cochlea resides, and in the cochlea is converted to electrical impulse. But in the case of a microwave auditory effect, is the source is electromagnetic. So if you expose the biological tissue to a pulse of microwave energy, the tissue expands and induces a vibration. Instead of going through the middle ear, the microwave-induced vibration gets propagated to the inner ear directly.
Renowned author and speaker Nick Begich cites more than 30 patents that show mind control is possible. Begich used this infrasound device to demonstrate on me.
I can hear it when you press it to my skin, but not when you take it off.
Right, and so it's almost like it's right in the center of your head.
And you can do that even if you weren't touching my skin?
Not with this device, but if I were using a microwave carrier at a distance, we could achieve the same thing.
And something that I worked on, that I'm not proud of, but it's called the Voice of God weapon. There are 4 different technologies that can pipe voices into an individual's head. You're rewiring their thought processes and brains.
There are scientists that have come forth high up within the ranks of this research who have said, we've already used this. We use this to get them to drop their weapons by saying, drop your weapons, this is Allah.
They used it, I believe, in the Gulf War to tell the enemy at that time, lay down your guns, this is Allah. And it worked pretty well, because hearing voices which have no direction or sound, you have to assume that it's some spiritual entity. So it works pretty well.
And so when I aim it towards you, what you hear is made right next to your ears. So again, this idea of being able to put sound anywhere you want to is really starting to catch on. We've got the military had just deployed some of these into Iraq, where you can put fake troop movements a quarter of a mile away on a hillside. Or you can whisper in the ear of a supposed terrorist some biblical verse. I'm serious. We make a version of this which puts out 155 decibels. Pain is 120. So it allows you to go nearly a mile away and communicate with people, and there can be a public beach just off to the side and they don't even know it's turned on. We sell those to the military presently for about $70,000, and they're buying them as fast as we can make them.
Well, you have to understand what's happening. Military-industrial complex, they kind of figured out if you just go to a country and you blow the country to pieces, then you got to go in there and you have to rebuild everything you destroyed. They said there's got to be a better way to do this so that we can just go in there and we can just defeat the minds of the individuals, keep them from fighting us, and we don't have to destroy the infrastructure. We don't blow anything up anymore. We just go in there, turn these machines on, and force these people that would normally oppose us to be so sick that they just can't get up and do that. To make everybody so ill that they can't get out of bed and make a war. And so this is the future of warfare.
Wow. Okay, so the technology exists, but could it actually be being used on people like Nick Cruz to encourage these shootings?
We need to take note of how many other previous mass shooters have made similar claims about hearing voices, and dig a little deeper to see, have there been other mass shooters who have complained of the same issue? The answer is a resounding yes. Now coincide this with the fact that most of you probably know Richie from Boston. His channel was taken down recently for a bit, and it had to do with his video regarding what? Targeted individuals. Targeted individuals represent an umbrella name for people who are victims of these multiple forms of harassment, whether it be voice to skull or actual microwave weapons that are coming into the home.
YouTuber Richie from Boston also had previously come out and shared that he had been attacked with these microwave weapons.
I never talk about it because I never wanted to give the people the satisfaction to know that their techniques or whatever they were doing were working. But what was happening to me is in the middle of the night at the exact same time, every time I would wake up and my entire body would be vibrating, like there was electricity going through it. My heart would be racing. And certain other times, my skin would become hot to the touch, like somebody was holding a magnifying glass on it under the sun. That's electronic harassment. That is telling you to shut up.
Now, if any of you think that these microwave weapons are just fantasy, you should see what the Army just put up not too long ago regarding these very weapons.
Marines and several other DoD representatives had quite the heated demonstration at Quantico, Virginia from the Joint Non-Lethal Weapons Directorate.
This is a military area. Move away from the perimeter. I say again, this is a military area. Move away from the perimeter.
Their new active denial system boasts a reach far beyond any other non-lethal system, about 7 football fields to give it some perspective.
As you can see here, a demonstration of its effects. You have grown men told to be aggressive and move forward while holding large weapon-like objects, throw them down and run away like little kids. This active denial system is proof of one form of silent, invisible microwave weapon technology. It is fully operational and already in use today. It can be targeted to an individual person or blanketing an entire area.
They're bragging about it. They're bragging about it for crowd control, dispersion, but what is stopping them from using it covertly on Americans right now? Apparently nothing.
While the technology to cast voices into people's heads has been around since the 50s, the ability to cast voices into a particular person's head anywhere, anytime in the world is a newer technology. Electronic surveillance weapon specialist Roger Tulsis explains how.
What they do is they go and get your garbage in front of your house and get your DNA And then once they've got your DNA sequence, they can then go to a supercomputer and they can biocode directed energy attacks that will only go and bioresonate with your body. So that 3 people can be standing right next to you and nobody's going to feel the harassment except you, because these signals are biocoded to your body's tuning only.
Now imagine if you had these types of weapons assaulting you in your own home, preventing sleep, causing extreme pain and unwanted negative emotions.
Okay, I want to show you, family. Look. High radiation detected. See, it keeps going in and out as I move it. On this wall right here by my bed. This is my bed. This is my bed, and this is where I receive the most of my attacks. It says, high radiation detected. As I move away, it's picking up levels in here. The phone is pointing outside the window. Nothing, no reading from outside. And when you go up against this wall, boom, very high levels of radiation.
Now accompany that by public gain stalking, as well as actual voices telling you awful things in your own head. Sadly, this is not a fictitious Hollywood movie plot. This is happening to, some say, tens or even hundreds of thousands of Americans right now. Surprisingly, ex-President Obama established holding an annual open committee of bioethics. Here's what one doctor who spoke there had to say about the reality of the situation.
MK-Ultra radiation experiments mostly were done without informed consent. They were funded by the DoD and intelligence agencies. In the community, we are seeing an alarming rate of complaints of use of electromagnetic weapons. Microwave auditory effects, silent sound spectrum, EEG cloning, which has taken the lab out of the laboratory and into the home. Most of these, from the research that we reviewed, can be done remotely. It seems to be more weapons research than medical research. I personally corresponded with upwards of 1,500 victims, all complaining of identical complaints from every state in the nation of being exposed to electromagnetic radiation for the use of cognitive control or behavior control.
Thank you.
When it comes to thinking of Nick Cruz, I mean, if he actually heard these voices in his head telling him how to do it, you know, I would think, well, gosh, just because I heard something in my head, it doesn't mean I would go through with it. But you have to understand the deep levels of torture that many of these victims are having.
It's hard to know what these people hear because no one else can hear it. No one can record this. So to find out the kind of things that were said to them, I did find this man named Tivon Rivers. He's a cryptologic technician. He had high security clearance in the military before he became a victim of this harassment program. He since has been very outspoken about their methodology since he moved to a remote location in another country to deter their attacks. He specifically suffered with the voice to skull. Here's what he had to say about the kinds of things that they would say into his head.
It's the shock and awe of this weapons platform. When you're hit with it, you're trying to figure out what the heck is going on with me. And there you are. You're tracked 24/7.
Now that we've defined what V2K is, can you describe your experience with it?
These signals, when it hits the skull, the apparition are voices. So someone's on the other end speaking a string of sentences that only you, the target, can hear.
What kinds of things do they say?
For lack of a better word, quite frankly, demonic. And I think, by the way, these scripts vary.
Mm-hmm.
They vary from person to person. I believe these scripts are to destroy the person on all levels so that they have a mental breakdown. So for me, the intelligence would be the following sentences. You're a spy. You are a traitor. Someone needs to kill you and take you out. Or sometimes they'll say in the third person, someone needs to take this person out. I think a lot of people who are experiencing V2K, by the way, are threatened regularly with their lives about each day they're going to be dead.
Yeah.
Or they're going to die in their sleep.
I found dozens and dozens of YouTubers who have been suddenly diagnosed with schizophrenia, but whose forms of symptoms perfectly match the torture programs of psychotronic weaponry that targeted individuals describe. They detail the voice to skull, with the voices often telling them that they should fear for their lives or hurt others. They describe having their thoughts read through these EEG weapons. As well, they describe the painful effects of microwave weaponry to their bodies. There is no telling how many are walking around with a false diagnosis of schizophrenia, but who are actually targeted. In some cases, the controllers seem to want them to stay on their meds. Could this be medical research as well? Some estimate each target generates millions of dollars of research money.
I'm scared. My voices keep telling me that everyone's gonna kill me. They keep saying how my mom's gonna kill me. They just keep saying how everyone is gonna kill me. Everyone's gonna kill me. Everyone's gonna kill me. I don't feel safe. My mom is supposed to come right now, but they say when she gets here she's gonna stab me. She's not gonna stab me. Shut up. You're not right. I don't know what to do. I don't know if I should go to the park, get out of the house, because they said I'm not safe here. I don't want to do this anymore, man. It's horrible. Please stop saying that. You're telling me to go get the knife. Go get the knife.
Dominique!
Yeah? What?
Where are you?
I'm in my closet.
What are you doing in your closet?
Guys, the more I learned about this program, the more my heart ached for those who are having to deal with it. I found a number of documents that seem to be leaked PowerPoint slides from this TI program. There are ways here listed how to discredit a target or a target's company. You see things like write a blog purporting to be one of their victims. Many of the targets are complaining about having their character assassinated so that they can no longer work. Another ex-agent admitted to putting child porn onto a target's computer. Really evil stuff, guys. And check this out. There was actually this pyramid that established the basic needs of a self-actualized person. It starts at the bottom with physiological needs, then safety needs, then belongingness and love needs, and then self-esteem needs. So it goes from basic to psychological needs. These are the very things that are destroyed with this program in order to break a person. I mean, just really, really sick. You might be saying, but with so many involved, why wouldn't someone come out and expose it? To that I'd say, the people who are deeply involved in this do not want to have the tables turned and become targeted themselves, which is exactly what happened to this whistleblower who worked in the TI system for years before his conscience caused him to speak out.
So everything that's done by this program is meant to have a psychological effect so that they are brought to a place in their life where they're isolated, they're broke, they're unemployed, they have no family, they have no friends, and nobody in the general public can track or trace anything that's being done to them because the technology is remote and it's wireless and there's usually no physical signs left on the individual that anything is being done to them. They are specifically instructed, do not slash anyone's tires. Don't vandalize their house. That is not the point of the program. The point of the program is to have maximum psychological effect and leave the minimal amount of evidence. When I decided to blow the whistle and this technology was turned against me, a massive organized stalking effort was launched against me. And due to my training, I recognize the tactics that are used.
Well, what sort of things are you getting, V2K? What kind of things are they telling you?
The main one that they repeat all the time is, be quiet or we're going to kill you. Stuff to try to turn people against each other. They're trying to turn me against former employers, people I used to work with, family members, friends, people I'm meeting online, and it's just a constant 24/7 back and forth. Don't trust this person. Do trust that person. Don't you dare try to work again or we're going to kill you. Don't you dare try to contact this person or we're going to kill you. And so you can start to see how psychologically this is going to have an effect on someone very, very quickly.
This is Aaron Alexis, armed with a sawed-off shotgun.
Now that you know the details of this program and what these targeted individuals go through, I'd like to take a little deeper look at these shooters.
And today, the first official explanation of why.
Was a mentally unstable individual.
This shotgun is the primary murder weapon.
On it, he etched a number of carvings, which I believe forced the media to have to cover his claims of being targeted.
Including End to the Torment, Better Off This Way.
And he also wrote My ELF weapon, ELF standing for extremely low frequencies. These are the types of frequencies that are being sadistically used against targeted individuals.
Alexis had been hearing voices and believed he was being bombarded by microwaves.
Alexis told police he believed that there were two men and a woman and that they were, quote, using a microwave machine to send vibrations through the ceiling, penetrating his body so he could not sleep, unquote. And he told police that he never felt anything like this, that he had no history of mental illness in his family. He felt the individuals would harm him.
The attack came without warning. As seen on this airport surveillance video, coming into view from the left, 26-year-old Esteban Santiago pulls out his pistol and opens fire. He killed 5 people. Now the question is why Santiago even had a gun, which had been taken away last November when he showed up at the FBI office in Alaska to claim he was hearing voices and was hospitalized for a mental examination.
The gun was taken away from him, but is given back after he was cleared.
Attorney Myron May's case was one that was particularly heartbreaking to me, as everyone who knew him personally confirmed his compassion, kindness, and sensitivity.
You sweet young man.
Not only did he send out 10 certified mail packages to major media outlets like Associated Press, detailing the TI program and his affidavit of being tortured, he also released a 3-part YouTube video series stating similar info and telling his family members and friends goodbye.
And the biggest reason why I'm doing this is that, for me, I'm already here. I'm already a targeted individual. I've already been subjected to torture. But if this program can stop, then maybe, just maybe, other people won't have to be tortured psychologically and physically and financially and emotionally. Maybe.
Although brandishing a gun and shooting it a few times, he didn't actually kill anyone in the event at his alma mater's library, FSU, before being shot himself about 30 times. But his case brought up a detail that I wonder if every TI who acts out these shootings hears as well from these voices that taunt them. He was told by his voices if he would act out this shooting as per their demands, he would effectively be removed from the torturous program. Here's the Facebook post of his on a targeted individual page asking if anyone else had been promised freedom with the killing. Certainly, this is not to say that every single mass shooter or murderer is a TI victim, nor that every violent person who says they have heard voices are TIs. This life is a spiritual war, and demonic possession is also real, striving to destroy lives in every way. The glorification of violence in our media and through desensitizing and graphic first-shooter video games played by anyone, much less young kids, certainly has not helped matters. That said, the high percentage of mass shooters that seem to potentially be victims of this mind control experiment is reason enough to dig deeper and demand that our leaders look into this voice of God weaponry and targeted individual military experiment much more seriously. When you dig into this, it's Pandora's box. There is just incident after incident of people being described as previously normal, with sudden onset voices in their heads, which is not, by the way, how schizophrenia works. Schizophrenia is a more gradual process, and typically people who were described as never quite right to begin with. But to give you an idea of the scope of this, I'll list some of the examples that I've come across that could potentially be TI victims. By the way, this is not to justify these actions. What they did was wrong. But if they were targeted and therefore tortured, then the people who did that to them were, in my opinion, just as guilty as those who carried out these atrocities. The victims and their families of these people have more of a reason than anyone to look to get to the bottom of this evil TI program. Here are some of them that I found. Prior to the shooting killing 12 in New York, Jiverly Wong sent a letter to 10 Now Local News, and the letter stated in broken English that the police had been terrorizing him for approximately 18 consecutive years as they followed him from California to New York. The methods of torture he described in the letter were casebook TI, 24-hour surveillance, character assassination, breaking and entering into his home, and deep sickness from microwave weapons and V2K that included putting constant music into his head. Gavin Long released YouTube videos where he openly discussed being a targeted individual. He killed 3 police officers he apparently thought to be involved with his harassment. Tamerlan Tsarnaev is one of the brothers suspected of the Boston bombing, had also heard voices in his head before committing the attack. In fact, he used the term majestic mind control to describe the phenomena, according to a background story published by the Boston Globe. Tamerlan also told friends that the voices were ordering him to do things. As he got older, the voice became more authoritative and its bidding more insistent. Miriam Carey drove her car through a White House barrier before she was shot to death by security in front of her baby girl. Miriam Lee openly stated several times in her case it was Obama's voice in her head making demands of her, thus her trip to the White House. Considering it now only takes a small sample of someone's voice to create a sample audio track able to say anything, this is certainly feasible with the same voice-to-skull technology. Sister of Scott Ulstrom said, "My brother is not this monster. He's not cold-blooded. He hears these voices. Honestly, in my heart, I believe there's only so much a person can take." Truth be told, we will never know how many shooters have been driven to kill with this program. But knowing it exists can help us understand how to detect those who may be caught in it, and should encourage all of us to be praying against its effectiveness.
This isn't the end game. This is the research. So this video is not to promote fear in the least. It is to create an awareness around the tactics of the beast so that we all are not fooled by these tactics when they come our way in the future. One of the things that I noticed when I'm studying all these targeted individuals, one thing that I saw again and again was that people turn to prayer. People turn to prayer to reach out and to build a more intimate relationship with God to get them through. And I see in the comment section over and over and over, that is the only thing that worked for many people.
And I protect myself from it with the full armor of God. Hit your knees and pray like you've never prayed before. It worked for me.
I hope that this information helped create awareness around this dynamic so that you can pray for those who are being targets. Put a hedge of protection around the people who are suffering from this. No weapon used against us shall prosper, so that none of these techniques will have any effect on those of us who are walking with Him.
Well, it's both a pleasure and an honor to be here. I want to thank Steve for inviting me and the Hippocrates Institute. A couple things. The way it's scheduled is sort of breaking this talk into two parts, so part of it's today, and I know there's panels tonight and a second part tomorrow. But here's really the scope of these two talks. One is to look really closely about what we know about mental disorders, and do they fix chemical imbalances in the brain, and how those drugs affect the brain. That's part of it. And is it different than what we're told? And then the second part of it is looking about how these medications affect long-term outcomes. So how does it affect us and our ability to function, the course of these disorders, which we take them for, over the course of 2, 5, and 10 years, which is a very different question as to why drugs get approved by the FDA. So just looking at the long-term effects. And we'll do that for antidepressants today and antipsychotics and stimulants for kids tomorrow. Just one thing that Steve was mentioning. So most of your speakers at the conference are doctors, they're medical doctors, they're PhD. I come at this as a journalist. So I've been writing about medicine and science in different forums for a long time, newspapers, magazines. And I think it's important to note I initially had a completely conventional understanding of psychiatry and its medications, which my understanding was we were making great progress in understanding the biology of mental disorders, and that we now had drugs that fix the chemical imbalances that cause those mental disorders, like diabetes for insulin. And if you hear that metaphor tells of a fantastic advanced medical advance. It means you've identified the pathology, and now you have a treatment for that pathology. And if you go through the history of medicine, that's generally when you make great leaps forward, when you identify the pathology and you get a specific antidote. And in fact, in 1998, I co-wrote a series for the Boston Globe, that was mentioned, on abuses of psychiatric patients in research settings. And one of the things we looked at were studies where they had withdrawn antipsychotic medications from patients diagnosed with schizophrenia. We said that was unethical because the drugs were like insulin for diabetes. They fixed a dopamine imbalance in the brain, and we said you would never withdraw insulin from a diabetic, at least in mainstream medicine. So why would you do studies where you withdrew antipsychotics from schizophrenia patients? I mention this just to say I started out with completely conventional understanding of psychiatry, what was going on, and that's a story of great progress. Real quickly, these two different books. The first book, which was published in 2010, Anatomy of an Epidemic, of these two books I'll really be talking about, that's the book that really looks at the long-term outcomes for people diagnosed with schizophrenia and treated with medications, or diagnosed with depression and treated with antidepressants. And just one of the things here is we as a society have really embraced the use of psychiatric drugs, especially since the arrival of Prozac in 1987. In 1987, we as a society were spending about $800 million on psychiatric drugs. Today, we're spending about $40 billion a year in the United States on psychiatric drugs. That's a 50-fold increase. And as that has happened, all the markers of the burden of mental illness in our society have exploded, upwards, increased. And one of the ways I look at Anatomy of an Epidemic is the number of people on disability in the United States receiving a government payment, SSI or SSDI, due to mental illness. That's why they get declared eligible. In 1987, we had about 1.25 million people on disability due to mental illness receiving one of those government payments. Today, we have about 5 million people. So during this time when we've really embraced the use of psychiatric disorders rather than decrease the burden, you see this remarkable increase. How about kids? It's really since 1980s we began medicating kids quite a bit, ADHD, then juvenile bipolar disorder, etc. In 1987, there were 16,200 children in the United States receiving a disability payment or their families due to mental illness. Any idea how many today? It's about 750,000. So during this time when we've begun medicating kids, we're seeing rising burdens of mental illness. So that's sort of a conundrum I explore in Anatomy of an Epidemic, and what I look at is, what is science telling us about how these medications affect us over the long term? And I'll have some of that data today and then some of it in the presentation tomorrow. Now, this new book that just came out, I actually co-wrote this, and this came out of, I was a fellow at Harvard at the Safra Center for Ethics, and they set up a lab to study institutional corruption in society. So how do institutions with a public mission, like Congress, which is supposed to serve the people, or a medical specialty like psychiatry, which is supposed to serve patients, are there influences on that institution that corrupt their behavior? And what we look at in this book is two corrupting influences, and I'll talk a little bit about this today as well as we go through the chemical imbalance story, is the influence of pharma money to the APA, American Psychiatric Association, and to individual academic psychiatrists, and also guild interests. So psychiatry, of course, competes with patients with a lot of different professions, social workers, people offering alternative therapies, psychologists, and so they have a need to promote a certain story that helps get people into their offices and taking pills as well. And so we looked at how that story that is told to the public, in fact, is out of sync with their own underlying science. So this is a conference with the title, The Real Truth About Health. This book really is the real truth about psychiatry. What is its science actually showing? So let's go to, this is just how I'm going to break it down between the 2 days. We're going to go over the chemical imbalance story, why we came to believe in it, the scientific investigation of that story, then how psychiatric drugs actually change the brain, and then we'll look at the effect of antidepressants over the long term. That'll be today, and then tomorrow we'll do a little bit about this rise of the burden of mental illness, and then we'll look at the long-term effects of antipsychotics and stimulants on children. So, how did the public come to believe in this story, the low serotonin theory of depression? Well, if we go back to, and we've all seen this on our TVs, right? You turn on your TV and they say you don't have enough serotonin, you take the pill, your serotonin is balanced, and now you're no longer depressed and you're walking on a beach with a beautiful woman, right? We've all seen that. Here's how this story came about. In 1980, the American Psychiatric Association published the 3rd edition of its Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Now, in its first two editions, it basically had more of a psychological explanation for why people became depressed and anxious. There were Freudian theories, and there was the sense under Freudian theories was, some of this happened because of unconscious urges, but there was an improper adjustment to there was an adjustment to your environment that led to stress, whether it be depression, anxiety, etc. But in the 1970s, psychiatry was coming under a lot of criticism. There was a sense that its talk therapies weren't any more effective than talk therapies by people who were much cheaper to go to. There was some question about the validity of these different disorders. You can read in psychiatric archives how the profession felt it was headed for extinction. There was so much criticism. And then, among themselves, they said, what is an image that a profession in our society that has such great prestige, such legitimacy? And they said, of course, the medical profession, the white coat. So part of what they do when they publish the DSM-3 is they want to have, quote, a medical model that tells to the public that these are diseases of the brain, and once you have diseases of the brain, who do you go to? You go to doctors who can prescribe drugs. So my point is, a lot of the reason for this DSM-3, they're now going to reconceptualize depression as a disease of the brain and not something that happens to people because they lose jobs or they get divorced or they suffer all the setbacks. They're going to locate all distress now in the individual, in the brain, and they're going to start calling these things diseases of the brain, things depression, kids who aren't behaving right in school, anxiety, etc. And once they reconceptualize it this way, of course, the drug companies are happy because you can get drugs approved for market for diseases. You can't get them approved for market for neurotic disorders. So this is a big switch. And now they're going to start selling this disease model to the American public. And by the way, the minute this book is published, they start forming PR campaigns. They start training their own psychiatrists what to say to the press. They start courting the press, they hire PR people, and so this is the moment they're going to sell a new story to the American public about the basic nature of psychiatric disorders. And you see right away, now I'm just going to show you how there's been this constant drumbeat within comments to the public about how these drugs fix chemical imbalances in the brain. And remember, if this is so, if you have depression because you have low serotonin, and the drug fixes that, that's a story psychiatry is telling us of a great advance. And it is saying that its new conception of mental disorders as diseases of the brain is correct. It's been validated by science. That's what this story is telling us. So we go here, we can just do this. 1981, researchers believe clinical depression is caused by chemical imbalance in the brain. This is Associated Press. Now in 1984, who's Nancy Andreasen? She's going to be, after this, the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Psychiatry. She's going to be one of the most important people in American psychiatry for 20 years as that position. This book also signals a sea change in our society as it becomes a best-selling book, and you can now start charting after this newspapers and magazines saying, we've discovered that these emotional problems are due to a broken brain. It's the individual's problem. Something's wrong with the brain. And what does she say? There are many hints that mental illness is due to chemical imbalances in the brain, and that treatment involves correcting these chemical imbalances. So 4 years after adopting this model, we're now starting to hear about these great advances. 1987, the FDA approves Prozac for marketing, for sale. Prozac is known as a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So the image presented to the society is this. And we'll go into this a bit more. Depression is caused by low serotonin, by inhibiting its uptake from that synaptic cleft between neurons. You elevate serotonergic activity in the brain. That fixes that problem. And this story goes out, and the story is we're curing depression. But it's also a story, think about this. You can't just take this pill now for a little while and come off of it because you have something like diabetes. You now have to take that pill forever. You see what a great marketing thing that is? They take a person now who has a problem, some depressive episode, and they turn him into a lifelong patient with this story. And now it's after this we have direct-to-consumer marketing, and of course you start seeing your TV ads about, you know, how wonders of these drugs curing people. And you also see things in 60 Minutes about how people are cured of depression by this. Time magazine runs a study that says these drugs cure 70% of depressed patients immediately and 90% cured over the long term. Now that cured means you're fixing something biological. And you'll see this. Antidepressants restore the chemical imbalance scientists have linked to many depressions. This is a former president of the APA in an interview with a Florida newspaper. Just keep going. And look who I'm quoting here. I'm tracing statements by the heads of the American Psychiatric Association or statements by like the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Psychiatry. These are not outliers. These are the people we look to in the United States for telling us the truth about what's going on. So Richard Harding, we now know, we're not supposing, we know that mental illnesses are not moral weaknesses or imagined, but real diseases caused by abnormalities of brain structure and imbalance of chemicals in the brain. We know this. 2001, antidepressants restore brain chemistry to normal. She's a future president. 2005, the American Psychiatric Association surveys the American public, and they have good news to report. 75% of people now understand that mental illnesses are usually caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain. This is good news. And then they send out, after doing this press release, after this survey, a press release, and they say a psychiatrist is a specialist specifically trained to diagnose and treat chemical imbalances. So they're saying we are the experts in fixing brain chemistry. You'll see this. They now issue a Let's Talk About Depression brochure. Antidepressants may be prescribed to correct imbalances in the levels of chemicals in the brain. And then I just went to some recent websites. These are things where you go on the internet, and these come with, by the way, if you go into the scientific advisory councils of these different groups, they are filled with the leading psychiatrists in America in mood disorders, presidents of the APA, etc. What do they tell us? Antidepressant medications work to restore proper chemical balance in the brain. Depression is caused by a chemical imbalance in the brain. And the National Alliance of Mental Illness research has shown that imbalance in neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine can be corrected with antidepressants. So you see in this line of quotations since 1980, 30 years of telling us of a simple fact. We know that depression is caused by low serotonin, and the drugs fix it. It's a story of a great advance, and something like, it's antidepressants, I think, are the #1 prescribed drug in America today, and something like 25% of all women between 20 and 55 now take an antidepressant on a daily basis, and something like, let's see if I can get this right, 13% of all mothers now take an antidepressant while pregnant. So we want to see a little bit about how that may affect things as well. So, now let's just go and see if science supports this story. Is psychiatry being honest with us as they tell us this powerful story? Real quickly, how do neurons communicate in the brain? And this is just a diagram you can pull from anywhere, a medical textbook. You have a presynaptic neuron that releases that chemical, that neurotransmitter like serotonin, into the tiny gap between neurons, which we call the synaptic cleft. Those molecules, the serotonergic molecules or dopaminergic, they bind, we say, they bind with receptors on the receiving neuron, which is called the postsynaptic neuron. And you've probably all heard this metaphor. They fit like a key into a lock, right? And when that happens, that's how a message is passed from one neuron to the next. Right? Just basic. Now, how did the chemical imbalance theory of mental disorders arise? It arose not from an understanding of what was happening in depressed patients or people with psychosis. It arises in the 1960s, from an understanding of how the drugs act on the brain. So if we go back to here, imagine this. So you have that serotonin that is released into the synaptic cleft, right? Now the brain has to have a way to remove that serotonin to end the message, to have this crisp signaling system. Does that make sense? And that serotonin is removed from that gap in one of two ways. Either it goes back into the presynaptic neuron via reuptake channels, that's one way, or an enzyme comes along, metabolizes that serotonin, and those metabolites are carted off as waste, okay? And what researchers found in the 1960s that the two antidepressants at the time, tricyclic antidepressants and monoamine oxidase inhibitors, they both inhibited that removal of serotonin from the synaptic cleft. Tricyclics did it by blocking the reuptake channels, okay? Monoamine oxidase inhibitors inhibited the enzyme that metabolizes serotonin. So for both ways, although by different mechanisms, you kept serotonin in the synaptic cleft longer than normal. So researchers said this: if we're upping serotonergic activity, and they were also upping norepinephrine, maybe the cause of depression, it's a hypothesis, is that people with depression have low serotonin. So the chemical imbalance theory of mental disorders arises from an understanding of how drugs act on the brain, and researchers hypothesizing the opposite is the problem, okay? But it doesn't arise from investigations into people with depression or schizophrenia. So now, what do we have to do? We have to see, do people with depression have low serotonin before they go on the drugs? Now, this is just for various reasons, they begin focusing on serotonin rather than norepinephrine, and this is just looking how an SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, blocks the removal. What happens is that drug sits in the reuptake channel, and therefore you can no longer remove it. So, they began doing this even before Prozac comes to market, and they give... They don't give people an SSRI before they do this initially. What do? What is the science to try to check with people to see if they have low serotonin before they're medicated? Well, they know this. So you release the serotonin, then normally it's broken down into metabolites, and so they say we can measure the level of metabolites in the cerebrospinal fluid, and if people have low serotonin, then they should have low amounts of metabolites in that cerebrospinal fluid. You see the indirect measurement? So they run such a study in the 1980s, and what they find is those metabolite levels are perfectly normal. Now, they do fall along a bell curve. There's some at a low end and there's some at a high end, but then you do the same thing with, quote, normal people, and you see the same bell curve. And then they also looked like, well, maybe the people who respond to antidepressants are those at the low end of the bell curve, and their serotonin is being fixed by the drug. And what they found, then when they put these people on medication, there was no correlation between response to the drug and your metabolite levels. So in 1984, the NIMH says it doesn't look like a problem in the serotonergic system is associated with depression. This in 1984 is the beginning of the collapse of the low serotonin theory of depression, 3 years before Prozac is brought to market. Okay? Now, after Prozac is brought to market, they keep on researching this, and they keep on trying to find, is there something wrong with the serotonergic system? Okay, maybe the problem is, okay, it's not that the presynaptic neurons release too little serotonin. Maybe the problem is those postsynaptic receptor neurons have too few receptors for the drug. Maybe that's the abnormality. But they don't find it. Now, here is something from the American Psychiatric Association's own textbook in 1999 that sums up this long search for a chemical imbalance in depression. And so what do they say to themselves? It says it was first the monoamine hypothesis is the low serotonin and low norepinephrine hypothesis, because these are both known as monoamines. First proposed in 1965. This is why the drugs work. However, watch this. Inferring neurotransmitter pathophysiology from an observed action of a class of medications on neurotransmitter activity is similar to concluding that because aspirin causes gastrointestinal bleeding, headaches are caused by too much blood loss, and the therapeutic action of aspirin in headaches involves blood loss. They're poking fun of the hypothesis, saying it was sort of silly from the beginning to just hypothesize that the problem is the opposite of what the drug does. Now, this is as they're telling you, you have low serotonin. This is in their own textbook. It says additional experience has not confirmed the monoamine depletion hypothesis. We're not finding it to be so. Who's Stephen Stahl? He is a molecular psychiatrist. He believes in the brain disorder concept. But then he reviews that in his textbook, Essential Psychopharmacology. There is no clear and convincing evidence that monoamine deficiency, that serotonergic deficiency, accounts for depression. That is, there is no real monoamine deficit. Who's Eric Nestler? I'm just showing you. He's considered one of the leading scientists in the world on neurotransmitter activity in general, and also how it might relate to cognition and psychiatric function. And what does he say? In 2010, we have looked at this in every way we can. We've depleted serotonin. We've looked at genetic associations. We've looked at all this. There is little evidence to implicate true deficits in any of these neurotransmitters in the pathophysiology of depression. And then again, he says, this is not a surprising finding because there's no reason that the mechanism of action of a treatment is the opposite of disease pathophysiology. So you're seeing again here, this hypothesis sort of had a false beginning, a false rationale. Who's Alan Frazier? Alan Frazier was one who was investigating this low serotonin theory of depression in the 1970s. Now this is starting to come out now, finally. I mean, I wrote about it I've written in both books before, Psychiatry and Influence, but what does he say? I don't think there's any convincing body of data that anybody has ever found that depression is associated to a significant extent with loss of serotonin. So you see how this has been going on now for 20 years? So real quickly, let's just go on the dopamine hypothesis. It's basically the same story. How do antipsychotics work? Now they block those receptors on the receiving neuron. Therefore they act as a brake on dopaminergic activity in the brain. So researchers hypothesized maybe schizophrenia is due to too much dopamine activity in the brain, the same sort of thing. Did they find then that people with schizophrenia prior to being medicated had overactive dopamine systems as a matter of course? 1994, that was falling apart. Stephen Hyman, who's he? He's the former director of the NIMH. He's a neuroscientist at Harvard. What does he say? No compelling evidence. And this is this is coming out of Swedish researchers, and the important reason why it's from Sweden is actually Sweden scientists have a really vested interest in the dopamine theory because it was a Swedish scientist who first discovered how antipsychotics act on the brain. What does he say? Any simple exclusive pathology of the dopamine system was and is doubtful. Now, it is beginning, so here's some summaries of this long search. Who's Kenneth Kendler? One of the world leading researchers in trying to find chemical imbalances, and he writes in 2005, we have hunted for big, simple neurochemical explanations for psychiatric disorders and have not found them. Now, this last quote is my favorite quote. So there's a number of people now writing about how this story never panned out. As again, I wrote about it first in 2002 and then in 2010. And so what does Ronald Pye say? In truth, the chemical imbalance notion was always a kind of urban legend, never a theory seriously propounded by well-informed psychiatrists. In fact, he says this whole story was promoted by enemies of psychiatry to make them look bad. I swear to God, if you read the whole quote. And all you have to do is go through that first group of quotes to show that this is nonsense. I mean, it's not nonsense in one way. They did know it was falling apart a long time ago. That's the truth of the matter. In fact, I was given a grand rounds at Massachusetts General Hospital after Anatomy of an Epidemic came out. And it was rather tense, as you might imagine, because actually a lot of the psychiatrists in the audience were people who've taken a lot of money from drug companies. And there was a rebuttal, and one of the people came up and said, you know what? You used a straw man to make us look bad in that book. You said we tell people that they have chemical imbalances in the brain. And he said, that is an outdated model. We've known since the early 1980s that that wasn't so. That's what they said. And they were yelling at me for putting it in the book as if psychiatry had told people they had chemical imbalances. So I said to the audience, there was about 100 and 150 people, and I said, you know what, you're right. You did know it was not true in the early 1980s, But I'm pretty sure you forgot to inform the American public of that. So again, this is a conference about the real truth about health. Do you see the betrayal here? They're telling people who are depressed they have broken brains. You have to be on the drugs for life. These fix a known pathology. Now, one of the things in our law is that medicine is supposed to be based on informed consent. Informed consent means you have to be honest about what you know about the problem, and you have to be honest about the risks and benefits of whatever the treatment is. This tells you that psychiatry has been practicing for the last 30 years in violation of informed consent standards. And that's what you've seen here in about 25 minutes, I guess. Read this. Because it's collapsing now, psychiatrists, some of them are being asked, well, why did you tell people that? Just read this. Basically, he's saying we lied to patients because it's good for them. And actually, you can see other people. Well, it reduces the stigma, which isn't true, by the way. But that's what they're saying. We knowingly lied because it's good for people. And it's hard to form good medicine when you're lying to people to make but you really see it makes us look better. Okay, now the question is, you take this drug, you take Prozac or an SSRI, how does it change your brain? Because what we've found so far is that prior to going on the medication, you don't have any known abnormality. Your brain, as far as we can tell, is normal, right? But the drug is going to change your brain. And then there's even some sense it may change your brain permanently. Okay? Now, I'm going to go back to the antipsychotics because it's in the antipsychotics that have been done the most research on how the drugs change the brain. But then we'll get into the SSRIs. This is just a diagram of how a dopaminergic neuron happens before you go on the drug. So you have a presynaptic neuron. You'll see like 4 receptors on the receiving neuron. You'll see the little black dots are the dopamine it binds, okay? Now think about this. What an antipsychotic is going to do, it's going to sit in those dopamine receptors. It's going to gum up that lock, okay? So now dopamine can't bind with those receptors. It's acting as a brake on dopaminergic transmission. Now what do we know about the brain? Extraordinarily neuroplastic, right? It's going to try to adapt to the presence of that drug. So if you put down the brake, what do you think it's going to do? It's going to make more of the receptors. It's going to put down the accelerator. Now, here's the interesting thing here, is I'm taking this slide from a psychiatric textbook. And think about this for a moment. We find out that antipsychotics work by blocking dopamine receptors in the brain. We hypothesize the problem then is too much dopaminergic activity, and if you follow this story forward, here's what you find. In the 1970s, you find research papers saying, we may have found the cause of schizophrenia. Because in fact, 3 weeks after they put people on medication, they were showing elevated levels of dopamine metabolites in their cerebrospinal fluid. They said, we found the cause of it. These presynaptic neurons are putting out too much dopamine. But then you had to read the paper. They said, maybe this isn't due to the disease, but this is a compensatory adaptation to the drug. And they found out, sure enough, what happens is you go on an antipsychotic, puts down the brake. Now the presynaptic neurons, trying to compensate for that brake, put out more dopamine than normal, and that's why you get the higher cerebrospinal fluid. So once that was understood, then they looked at autopsy of people with schizophrenia, and they counted the density of dopamine receptors. They say, now we've found it. The problem's not with the presynaptic release of dopamine, it's that these people have too many dopamine receptors. We have found the cause of schizophrenia. It's too many dopamine receptors. That's why we have to block them. But then someone said, but maybe this is caused by the drug. And then they looked at people who had been never medicated. They did not have too many dopamine receptors. Then they found a way to look in living patients the density of these receptors through some labeling techniques, and they found out prior to being medicated, they didn't have that. So what they found was this sort of horrible fact. The drugs induce the very change in biology hypothesized to cause schizophrenia in the first place. And now as we look at the long-term effects of medications and antipsychotics, you're going to see how that comes into play, okay? But that's what they found with antipsychotics. What did they find with SSRIs? Think about this. SSRIs now act as an accelerator. What do you think the brain does? It's going to put down the brake, right, on serotonergic transmission. What researchers say, these compensatory adaptations are done to try to maintain a homeostatic equilibrium, a normal functioning of these pathways in the brain. So after you go on an SSRI, what do you see? The presynaptic neurons release less serotonin than normal, and the receiving neurons now decrease their density of serotonergic receptors. So again, what was depression hypothesized to be due to? Low serotonin. You go on an SSRI, and in fact, it drives your brain into a low serotonergic state. Okay? Just so you see this is Stephen Hyman. You might want to read this paper. He describes this process. I hope you see that this is not some alternative explanation of what's going on. This is what psychiatry investigating these, these theories. This is what they found. So this is the former director of the NIMH. They create perturbations in neurotransmitter functions. That's the blocking of, say, the reuptake or the blocking of receptors. The brain now tries to adapt for that. The chronic administration of drugs cause substantial and long-lasting alterations in neural function. What's happening is if you get a difference in the receptor densities, it means you're changing gene expression. Okay, so that's a fundamental change. There's some thought now that it will be handed down to kids because of epigenetic changes. Sometimes now it looks are inheritable. And what does he say? After a few weeks, the person's brain is now functioning in a manner that is qualitatively as well as quantitatively different from the normal state. So the American public, which has made antidepressants, they take more antidepressants than any other class of drugs, does so thinking they're fixing a chemical imbalance, that they're normalizing agents, when in fact the science shows they're abnormalizing agents. Now maybe this process helps people long term, maybe not. But you can see the whole thing is founded on put it mildly, a deception, a misinformation campaign that obviously serves certain interests. So now, as we go forward, we're going to see to ourselves, does this, when you go on this drug that changes your brain in this way, does it help people over the long term? And what are the long-term effects? Once you have this understanding, I think you can understand, you can immediately sense two things. You go on an SSRI. It drives your brain into a low serotonergic state. This is your new balance. This is the drug upping it. This is now your brain is in this substate. Now take away the drug when you come off. You see why you might have a problem? Because your brain has become used to the drug. So that's one thing. You're going to see that coming off is difficult. And then the second is, can you see once you conceive of drugs this way why long-term use might be problematic? It's not exactly the best functioning. Nature has sculpted our brains to function in a certain way. And the metaphor I like to use is this. When you leave here today, how many of you drove here today? Okay, here's what I want you to do. When you leave here today, put one foot on the accelerator, one foot on your brake of your car, drive like that for 6 years and see how it wears out your car. That's in essence, metaphorically, what you're doing, because you have the drug either putting on a brake or an accelerator and your brain is trying to compensate. Okay, now we're going to look at, in the next 35, 40 minutes, how antidepressants affect the long-term course of depression. And as we begin, and it's nice that this is the Hippocratic Institute, is when we begin that thought, how does a drug treatment affect long-term outcomes? You've got to go back to the Hippocratic Oath. Because what is Hippocrates saying? What does he say? He says, do no harm, right? What does that mean? Someone tell me, what does that mean? Don't make your patients worse, right? That's how it's usually assumed to mean. Don't make your patients worse. So they come in at a certain level, don't give them a treatment that makes them worse, 5 months later. It's actually much more subtle than that. What Hippocrates was saying, we in nature often have a natural capacity to recover from an illness. say depression or whatever, and your treatment, in order to not do harm, has to improve on that natural capacity to recover. So imagine this, just to understand this a bit better. Imagine you have a disease. People come in at a certain baseline of symptoms. You give them a treatment, 50% are cured, and 50% stay the same. Their symptoms stay exactly the same. No one gets worse. But you cured 50% of your people with your treatment. Have you met your Hippocratic Oath? No. Well, you're good. Most people go, yeah, you did it, 50% are cured. No one got worse. No, the point is, imagine in nature if 70% are cured or 80% are cured. Your treatment has knocked down the cure rate from 80% to 50%. So even as the doctor who's given the treatment is going, like, I have a treatment that cures 50% of people, until you know the natural recovery rate, you can't assess the merits of your therapies. And our normal method of testing for the efficacy of drugs doesn't touch this at all over the long term. We just have these things, 6-week trials, you take it against a placebo, and if it's a little better than placebo, over the short term we say it's effective. 6 weeks. Has nothing to do with long-term outcomes. So what we're going to do in the rest of this session is just look at how antidepressants affect the long-term course of depression. Like I said, tomorrow we'll do a couple others. So what do we have to do? The first thing we have to do is figure out what's the natural course of depression. What were scientists or researchers saying? What was the course of depression prior to the arrival of the antidepressants? And by the way, these are studies of people hospitalized for depression. These are seriously depressed patients. These are not people walking around in the community, these studies. So what do we find out? First of all, depression at this time was seen as mostly a disorder of the middle-aged and elderly. Do you know what 20-year-olds got back in the 1950s? They became anxious. Depression was a different thing. It basically was middle-aged and up. What was the prevalence of depression prior to the arrival of the drugs? Fewer than 1 in 1,000 suffered a depressive episode, seen as really a clinical episode each year. You'll see that very few people were actually hospitalized for it in 1955, only 7,000 first admissions. And here's the course of medicated depression, both short-term and then long-term. What they found in these hospitalized cohorts is that after 10 months, these are very depressed patients, that 80-85% would be discharged and the depression would have lifted within 10 months. And it would lift, basically, there'd be a certain percentage lift in 1 month, and then 2 months, and then 3 months, and 4 months. And anyway, by the end of 10 months, it'd be about 80-85%, and they would recover to what is known as euthymia, an absence of depression, not even low level. It would have passed. These are comments by the leading depression experts in the country in the 1960s who know that data, and you'll see what they said. We can expect recovery. Most depressions are self-limited. Regardless of what one does, the patient eventually will begin to get better. Now, this is the head of the depression section at the NIMH. Most episodes will run their course and terminate with virtually complete recovery without specific intervention. Because of this understanding of depression, the idea was we'll use antidepressants to speed up a natural recovery process. That was the thought with the antidepressants when they're introduced. How about long-term outcomes in the pre-antidepressant era? You'll see studies like this, and again, this is hospitalized patients. You follow people, they've been hospitalized, they get discharged, now you follow them for 15, 20 years. You'll find that about half of those patients never had another episode that required rehospitalization. And again, this is a very depressed cohort. About 30% over the course of 13, 15 years might have 2 to 3 episodes that required hospitalization. And you'll see data that says they'd have an episode, they'd be fine for about 3, 4 years, have another episode, so they'd have these long periods of euthymia. And you'll see there's about 20% of the hospitalized cohort that became chronically ill. Remember that figure, about 20%, okay? This is the view of depression in the pre-antidepressant era. This is the leading researcher on the long-term course of depression. He writes in 1969, insurance can be given to a patient and to his family that subsequent episodes of illness after a first mania or the first depression will not tend toward a more chronic course. So the understanding is it's an episodic course, all right? Now let's move into the antidepressant era. That's just concluding what I just said. Clinicians, they start using these antidepressants in the 1960s. And here's, if you go back to what they say, you start seeing this odd thing. My patients are getting better faster, but boy, are they relapsing a lot more back into depression than they used to. So right away with the introduction of these drugs, you see this worry arise that there might be a paradoxical long-term effect. That drugs, in fact, that help people, depression lift faster, somehow might predispose people to relapsing back into depression more frequently than before. And you'll see here, here's the two sort of comments picked about this. Now we get someone to test this chronicity worry. This is 1973. It's a Dutch psychiatrist. He has data for people treated with an antidepressant, people in a matched cohort for people treated without an antidepressant. And what does he find? At the end, I think this is a 10-year study. And he finds that it looks like antidepressants, quote, exert a paradoxical effect on the recurrent nature of the vital depression. In other words, this therapeutic approach was associated with an increase in recurrent rate, more relapses, and a decrease in cycle duration. That means the depressive episodes are coming more frequently. There's less time in euthymia. And then he said, should this increase be regarded as an untoward long-term side effect of treatment with tricyclic antidepressants? My point is here, we're going to follow this story of science from the beginning as it comes in. So we've got a couple points now. Clinical perceptions and the first test of this worry that maybe it's increasing the chronicity. So now they do a lot of studies looking at how fast people relapse after recovery from a depressive episode. And by 1997, Harvard researchers, they have a lot of studies that have studied this. And remember before, it used to be about 15 years before 50% would relapse. Now, it's 50% relapse within 14 months. So you see the shortening of that period in this data. And there's also something like this. They note the longer the patient is on the drug, the more they're likely to have frequent relapses as they come off. So now let's look, I'm going to go through all the research I can find that bears on this question, okay? So the NIMH does a trial in the 1980s, and it randomizes people to 4 arms. There's 2 forms of psychotherapy without drug. There's a tricyclic, and then there's placebo. This is the 16-week results. What do they find? There's actually no difference at the end of 16 weeks before the 4 groups, except among the very severely depressed. That's where you see some benefit at 16 weeks for the drug-treated patients. Then they do a follow-up, 18-month results. Actually, these results aren't even good for the psychotherapy patients, but what they find is the stay-well rate is highest for psychotherapy, lowest for the drug-treated group. And then they did a further analysis. If you look at dropouts, etc., the results look even worse. Patients receiving the antidepressant were most likely to seek treatment following termination, produced the highest possibility of relapse probability, and exhibited the fewest weeks of reduced or minimal symptoms during the follow-up period. So in this big study in the 1980s, they saw most chronicity in the drug-treated patients. Now, imagine you're a scientist or someone who's an expert in mood disorders in the 1980s, and you went to school in the 1960s. You were taught that depression is an episodic problem. Now you've got data showing it's a chronic problem. So in 1985, the NIMH convenes a meeting on this very question. What's going on? What is the course of mood disorders? And here's what they say. Watch what they say here, because this is really revealing. Improved approaches to the description and classification of mood disorders and new studies have demonstrated the recurrent and chronic nature of these illnesses and an extent to which they represent a continual source of distress and dysfunction. You see what's going on here? They're saying we have these new studies. They're showing it's run a chronic course, but they're not blaming it on the drug. They're saying those old studies were flawed and we finally found the true course of depression. But what's the difference? This is the course of medicated depression that they're seeing today. They're not seeing the old course of unmedicated depression, but they're saying this is an advance in science. I just want to show here, this is from the 1999 textbook, that you see within the field this recognition that their conception of depression has changed in the modern antidepressant era. It went from episodic, you see this, most patients would eventually recover. Now we have these studies that disprove this, shown that depression is a highly recurrent and pernicious disorder. So you see in their own minds, they've reconceived of what is the course of depression. Now, this study, the STAR-D trial, is the largest antidepressant trial ever conducted. It was funded by the NIMH, 4,041 patients. It was conducted in real-world patients. And I will tell you, the results were so bad they fabricated the results, and there's a whistleblower lawsuit. It's one of the things we write about in Psychiatry Under the Influence. They announced, just so you know, they announced that 67% of patients, there was no placebo in this group. The way the study was designed, you were put on a drug. If you didn't get well with the first drug, you could get a second drug. If you didn't get well on the second drug, you could try a third and then a fourth. You got 4 tries. And what they announced was that 67% of people eventually remitted. It's just not true. If you actually look about remission according to the protocol criteria, only 38% ever remitted. And we go through in the book about all the machinations of how they violated the criteria to up that announced rate. But here's the key on this. This study, if you go to the protocol, it said, this study will guide clinical care in the United States, because this is in real-world patients. It's not in, what happens is in so many of the FDA studies, they only allow certain types of patients in. Those studies really don't tell us about real-world patients. This is going to do it. And they said, we're going to have 2 parts to this study. We're going to show that if you keep trying, you can find a drug that works, and then people will stay well. The whole point is that this will show that people will stay well. They paid people to stay in the trial. They could adjust the dosages. It was real-world care. Now, if you go to the study and they announce the 1-year results, you just can't make sense of it. Okay? You just can't. You look at it, you know some data is presented, but you can't make sense of it. You know why you can't make sense of it? No, because the study results were horrific. Out of 4,041 patients who entered that study and got had this best clinical care possible, there were only 108 who remitted, means their depression went away, and stayed well and in the trial to the end of 1 year. And by the way, the next speaker, Irving Kirsch, is one of the people who's done some of the analysis of this data. So the real stay well rate was less than 3%. That's the worst outcome I've ever seen from any study of depression ever. So you can see that this is consistent with the idea that regular treatment, in fact, increases the chronicity of the disorder and may be inducing, in many people, a low-level chronically depressed state. This was another such study, real-world patients. It's much smaller. In this study, only 26% responded to antidepressants. Only half who responded stayed better. Only 6% remitted and were well at the end of 1 year. So these are the only 2 studies I know about in real-world patients in modern times. Both found very poor stay-well rates at the end of 1 year. Even he's surprised by this. This was a study in Minnesota. They looked at all their patients on HMOs that had a diagnosis of depression or dysmia at the beginning of 2009. Then looked at how those patients were doing at the end of the year, and you'll see that basically everyone, still, except for 1,131, were still depressed at the end of the year. Seeing a lot of chronic depression in this data. This is now just what I'm saying. What you hear, this is what the profession itself says now. 1/3 of unipolar patients are non-responders to antidepressants. You put them on, they go on to a chronic course. Another 1/3 are partial responders. In other words, their depression goes down severity when you go on the drug. They will be seen as being helped by the FDA. Okay, but they don't stay well. You'll see what they say. Resolution appears to be the first step of a more severe relapsing and chronic future course. This is when they don't completely remit. Now, about 1/3 do remit, at least, and this is what they're saying, 1/3 remit on the drug, and about half those stay well. I don't even know where they're getting the half stay well, but even by their own admission, they're saying only 15% of people with unipolar depression experience a single bout of the illness, and for the remaining 85%, remissions become less complete and new recurrences develop with less provocation. Psychiatry is telling you that with their pills, it runs a chronic course, right? That's what you're saying. This is not me. This is not critics. This is their own data. Okay? So, finally someone raises a question. Maybe the problem is your drugs are depressogenic agents over the long term. They cause a biological change that may be increasing your vulnerability to depression. And you'll see this is raised by Giovanni Fava. He's the editor of Psychotherapy and Psychosomatics. He raises this in 1995. And when he raises it, one of the most famous psychopharmacologist in the United States named Ross Baldessarini from McLean Hospital. He writes and he says this: I know this is uncomfortable to think about, but there's reason to worry about this. Okay, so he sort of legitimizes this as a valid inquiry. And then Giovanni Fava keeps hammering on this thing. He writes more articles about, are these drugs and depressogenic agents? And then a very well-known mood disorders expert in the United States, and I think it was Donald Klein, he writes to Giovanni Fava, and he makes this public. He says, stop raising this question. No one cares. The FDA doesn't care. The drug companies don't care. No one's going to fund research into it, so stop asking the question. He says this public. So what does Giovanni Fava write back? And he publishes it. Maybe you in the United States don't care, but we in Italy do, and we're going to keep raising this question. Now, think about this, though. You don't care, you've got 20% of your population or 15% on antidepressants, and you don't care if you're making them depressed? I mean, it's a betrayal. This is what we talk about in psychiatry under the influence. A medical profession should serve the public, not its corporate interests. And if you don't care about the long-term outcomes, you're not serving the public, in our belief. Okay, so now I'm going to look at, here's what we're going to do in the next 15 minutes. Now what I did in this book is I looked at all the studies I could find in modern times that compared the course of unmedicated depression versus medicated depression, okay? So this is in modern times. This was a study done in the Netherlands, a 10-year study, and they looked at first episodes of depression treated either with drug or without drug. Now I have to say, here in this data, it's actually not bad outcomes for the drug-treated patients. It's better than what you're seeing in the US studies. 50% only had one episode, 19% 2 episodes, 31% more than 2 episodes. But you see the unmedicated group, 76% never had another episode. So you can see here, even in this data, the unmedicated group is having fewer episodes, right? And if you look at the chronic group, it's 31 versus 13%. Okay? So, what do they conclude? A watchful waiting, because so often this is going to resolve. He's going back to these old days. If we just support people and give it some time, maybe it's going to resolve, okay? That's his finding. This is a large study in Canada. The way it worked was this. They had these survey data of almost 10,000 patients who were depressed, and then they just looked at people who were taking medication, who were not, and how many weeks they were depressed each year, and you'll see that the medicated group is depressed almost twice as much as the unmedicated group, okay? And this is people who initially had a diagnosis of major depression. What do they say? The researchers. I hope you see in this collection of data that's starting to, from all different ways, that is telling a pretty consistent story. This person did not want to find this, but this is what he found, and he says this is consistent with that hypothesis. Now, this was a study that was done by the World Health Organization. It was done to show the value of screening for depression, okay? That's the purpose, and here's the way it was designed. World Health Organization investigators trained in the US DSM-4 at the time definition of depression went into clinics in 15 cities around the world, and like flies in the wall, they looked at people coming in for all sorts of care and identified those who were depressed by these standards. And they said nothing. And then they waited to see if the general practitioner diagnosed depression and how they treated it. And what they expected was some cases would go unidentified, and they thought those people would have bad outcomes, and the people who got identified would have better outcomes, and the best would be identified and treated with depression, okay? So this is expected to show the value of screening for depression and finding it. Now, this is on something called the General Health Questionnaire scores. You'll see something interesting here. In the first 3 months, all groups are getting better. And he ends up with 4 groups. Diagnosed with depression, treated with sedatives, diagnosed, treated with antidepressants, diagnosed, no drug, and undiagnosed, no drug. Okay, that's the 4 groups. And what you see, there's improvement in all 4 groups, right, in the first 3 months. And you see the diagnosed antidepressants, that's the red group. All right, you see that red line? it's doing pretty well compared to the diminishment of symptoms over that 3 months. But then look what happens between 3 months and 1 year. Those not on drug continue to get better. Whereas those on drug, if anything, they're just staying the same. Okay, so you're not seeing this longer get well path. Now, this is the percentage of people who were depressed in each four groups at the end of 12 months. And you'll see the group that is most likely, half of them who are still depressed at the end of 12 months is the diagnosed and treated with antidepressant group. They have the worst outcomes. So what the researchers said? He said, they tried to explain this, and they said, well, you see those not giving drugs, they were a little bit less depressed at the beginning. But they said, that doesn't explain it. Something else is going on. Even after we adjust for that little bit difference in baseline scores, you're still seeing greater improvement in the unmedicated patients. This is a study of disability. This was a study in Ontario. It looked at all the people that went on short-term disability in that province in a couple years. I should have the N here. It's a large study. In Canada, if you miss work for 10 days, you go on short-term disability, and then either you get better and go on long-term, or you go back to work. So they looked at people who chose to take medication, those who did not, and they found that those who... Now, stop for just a second. If we just look at the medicated group that returned to work, 73% did. That's good, right? 3/4 are going back to work. Only 20% went on to long-term disability. But still, it's the unmedicated group that is less likely to go on disability and more likely to return to work. So they said, this use of this medication for somehow sort of get people to think of themselves as depressed, adopt a sick role. What they're saying is this. They're saying it's not the drug biologically, but maybe think about this. You go into your physician, they say you have a broken brain, you can't do anything about it, you can't change your diet, you can't exercise, you can't go volunteer or anything. You have this thing. Got to take drugs for life. You see the message you're giving to people? It's really a pessimistic message. It's you're sick, you're not ever going to be better. They are saying that maybe that's the problem, and frankly, I agree with that partly. That is a bad message to give people. You can't make changes in your life to get better. It is depressing. It is depressing. Literally, I've interviewed about 100 people, and they say, it took all hope away, basically. Basically, that's it. This is the largest modern study of this question. What is the course of unmedicated depression today? It came out of a large 25-year study of depression. They looked at, I think it had about N of about 500 people. They looked at those who were treated versus those who were not. You'll see the treated group, 3 times more likely to cessation of role function. That means either they lose their job, or if they're in a domestic role, they stop functioning in this way. The final is going on disability. You'll see a much higher rate of going on disability via the medicated group. Here's what the researchers concluded. The unmedicated group did not have a drop in socioeconomic status. And if you look at the unmedicated group, they did have a lot of upheaval in their lives. Divorce, that sort of thing. But they got through it is basically what happened, and they kept their jobs or moved to other jobs. Okay, remember what they said about having discovered the modern course of depression? It's chronic. So this guy does a study. He's from Brown University, and he just follows unmedicated people now. People who've been quite ill for 12 months. And what does he see? 1 month, most of them are still depressed. But how about 6 months? They're continually about 2% per week are getting better now. And by 12 months, 85% are better. Now, what was the course of unmedicated depression in the pre-antidepressant era? What did they say? 80 to 85% would be discharged within 12 months. They did a modern study, same thing. And what does he say now? You see how this puzzle is fitting together? We had a vision of unmedicated depression, which is actually a very optimistic vision. And then we adopt, in the medicated area, a very chronic idea about it. Now this person looks about it without this, and he finds most people are getting better. This is another study, and one of the things you got to understand here, all these studies are done with a certain expectation that the drugs work. So these are all studies, findings in essence that are surprising to the researchers. This was designed like this. NIMH study. Had 3 arms. It's elderly patients or older patients. People are randomized either to drug alone, Zoloft, Zoloft plus exercise, or exercise alone. Now, if you read the general sort of noise out there in newspapers and magazines, what do you hear? That drugs plus exercise are better than drugs alone. Okay, this was a study that was first done to really assess that. And what do you see? You see actually a lot of response in this way after 4 months in the Zoloft alone. 69% are in remission. That's extremely high. All I can tell you is they must have, who knows why. Sometimes science tells a different story. Exercise alone, 60%. But now they follow them for 6 months. And look what happens at the end of 10 months. 52% of those on Zoloft alone are depressed. 55% on Zoloft plus exercise. Only 30% of exercise alone. So the drug is actually, it's like an anchor on the stay well rate for the depressed patients. You see that? So drug plus exercise, 55% of that group is depressed at the end of 10 months. If you don't have exposure to the drug, or you're on drug alone, exercise alone, only 30% are on depressed at the end of 10 months. Okay, you see that? In this way, this drug is seen as an anchor. So, last little bit of this. You can see that this is starting to add up, right? The evidence. So now you actually do have some researchers beginning to hypothesize that why these drugs may be depressogenic over the long term. This is coming by Rifel Malik. He did a paper in 2011. Now, who's Rifel Malik? He used to work for Eli Lilly. So this is a guy who's very much in the mainstream when they were putting out Prozac. And now he's a psychiatrist at the University of Illinois, I think it is. So what does he say? The problem is these drugs induce brain changes that are the opposite of what the medication originally produced. Rather than raise serotonergic levels, these drugs over the long term impair these pathways in the brain. That's that compensatory adaptation, okay? And then they do note this, at least in studies with rats, if you really deplete serotonin with an SSRI, because those presynaptic neurons now put out serotonin less than normal, you'll get reduced serotonin now in the rats in 9 areas of the brain. It shows you it's showing it into a deficient state. Leads to an reduced density of receptors. And they do note that, so you give a rat SSRIs, it causes these changes, and you'll see like some behaviors that, at least in the rat model, are associated with sort of a dysphoric mood. They mount other rats less, that sort of thing. They show less curiosity. So, just read this. We're almost done here. So you see how they're putting the whole picture together? You go on an SSRI, drives you into a subserotonergic state. Now when you try to come off, that can be difficult because your brain is adapted to the presence, but even if you stay on, you may have this chronic illness. And look at the last statement. I'll try to get to that in just the end. Such processes may not be reversible, meaning even if you come off, maybe your receptor densities won't renormalize. Which means that going on the medications for a longer period of time is a pretty profound thing to do. And it means if you're doing it to your kids, maybe you should really be worried about this if you don't renormalize. We can talk about that in just a second. Anyway, quick few studies now. People are now investigating this in different ways. Do these drugs, do we have other evidence in humans that they increase the chronicity? This was a study where they looked at all the people who had remitted in studies either on placebo or on drug, okay? And now people are, this is only those who got better in the first study. And now what's going to happen with those who remitted on the SSRI, they are going to come off the drug, okay? And they found that among remitters, there's a relapse rate twice as high among the drug sort of responders, okay, or remitters. So what do they say? The fact that these antidepressants are perturbing these monoamine levels, then the brain compensates it. That increases the risk of relapse when the drug is continued. Antidepressant use appears to increase biological susceptibility to depression. This is another 2-year study. They looked at remitted patients. So some of these patients remitted on drug. Some remitted off drug, and then they just looked at drug use in the next 2 years. You'll see that 60% of those who stayed with antidepressants or used them relapsed. 64% of those who used it some, but only 26 who did not use medications. They did not relapse in that 2 years. What do they say? May be involved in increasing vulnerability to relapse. So you see people are increasingly worried that the drugs cause a change that makes you more vulnerable to depression. Here's the summing up of the evidence. Look at this. Clinicians recognize this when the drugs come in. They worry, is it causing a chronification of the disease? We see now that in medicated depression, it runs a much more chronic course. That STAR-D study, that study in the 1980s, we see it's recognized. In studies with modern studies, medicated, unmedicated patients, you see better outcomes for the unmedicated groups over the long term, 2, 5 years, etc. And now investigators have even proposed a biological explanation for why this is so, because the drugs cause the opposite effect of what is originally intended. Now, did you read about this paper in your newspaper? This is Rifel Malik. This is a mood disorders person who used to work for Eli Lilly. Or he might have just been a consultant. I don't know if he was on staff. Just read it. Don't you think the American public deserves to hear about this worry? By the way, I don't think tardive dysphoria is the same as depression, actually. You know, if you've known people on the antidepressants for a long time, many of them will say they just can't get excited about things anymore. They seem sort of numb. They can't get emotionally engaged. That's tardive dysphoria. He uses it tardive meaning later onset, and dysphoria I think is actually quite different than depression. So depression, it hurts, right? You've been depressed? It hurts. It hurts like hell. It's painful. What they're really talking about here is an absence of feeling, which in fact when we talk about the chronification of the disorder, it's not, I think actually what is happening is because of this serotonergic system, which is such a common pathway in the brain and throughout the body, it makes you less responsive to the world. It's actually a little, and it gets seen as chronic depression, but as much as anything, it's a chronic dysphoria, which I think is different than depression. So just real quickly, and then maybe I'll talk about, we got about 10 minutes, about why they're worried that the drugs don't renormalize. Just remember this, every drug has risk benefits, right? We've been talking about the benefit side of the equation, the capacity of these drugs to reduce depression. That's the benefit side. And now we're worried that it increases the chronicity. If you want to see then weigh the merits of the drugs, now you have to also look at all the negatives of that drug, the side effects. And you'll see there can be emotional blunting, you'll see some cognitive impairment. There are some people think that it increases the risk of early Alzheimer's, dementia, obviously gastrointestinal effects, sexual functioning, suppresses REM sleep, you'll see some movement disorders, and it's pretty well known now that if you're on an antidepressant while you're pregnant, it increases the risk of autism, preterm deliveries, and there's some worry that because serotonin signals in the brain helps the cells in the brain line up, it disrupts that normal sort of formation of cellular levels in the brain. And that's why they may hit, kids born to parents may hit developmental landmarks late. This is just seeing as we've been using antidepressants more, you'll see that the burden of depression has gone dramatically up in our society, and it's going up in society after society that has embraced the use of antidepressants. So what this shows us at the very least is that the widespread use of antidepressants is not a very good solution to the depression that erupts in a society. This is an alternatives conference. I'm not going to go into it, but obviously there's all sorts of things you can do if you get depressed. Diet, exercise, become socially engaged. So much of depression clearly is almost a sign that something's going wrong in your life. So maybe you need to make some changes. Last thing here, so that's, and like I said, we'll look at antipsychotics and stimulants tomorrow. Why are we worried that the receptor densities may not renormalize? There's two reasons for this, or there's different ways, I should say, that this worry is arising. One is because of the sexual dysfunction. So, you know, in the 90s, we began medicating youth, right? 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds with SSRIs. We never used to do that. Now, about 60 to 70% of people on SSRIs will experience some type of sexual dysfunction. Maybe a lack of desire is one, difficulty orgasming, stuff like that. There's different levels of dysfunction, but in different studies, it's 60 to 70%. So kids in the 1990s, as they're hitting puberty, are put on these medications. Their sexual interests are blunted. They go to college, starting in the early 2000s, and what do they want to do when they're at college? Have sex like everybody else, basically, right? And what they start doing is so now they go to their counselors, and some of this is research that's coming out of the University of Iowa, and they say, I want to come off my antidepressants because it's blunting my sexual drive. And so they'll go off the antidepressants. And about 25% find that they can't get their normal sexual function back. And there's even a word for this, it's called a term, PSSD, post-SSRI sexual dysfunction. Now, I did a magazine article. Well, I got commissioned to do a magazine article on PSSD. So when I got commissioned by the article, I pitched it to a magazine. The magazine editor said, hey, do you want to write about anything? I said, I want to write about PSSD in kids or youth. And I explained it to him, and he said, oh, that's a great story. And I said, but you'll never run it. I know you'll never run it. Look at your magazine. It's filled with pharma ads. You're not going to run this story. So I did the story, and they didn't run it. Anyway, I talked to many, many people who are now in this boat, and they say it's not just sexual dysfunction. They'll say things like this. I see a rainbow, I can't get excited. I see a pretty girl, I can't get excited. I hear music, I can't get excited. So it's that the sexual dysfunction is more of a marker for sort of a general malaise. Now that's one bit of evidence. The second bit of evidence on this is coming from rat studies. So once this worry arises, they begin giving rats at a dose appropriate for a rat weight. When they hit puberty, and I think a rat hits puberty at around 45 days, and they keep them on that dose through puberty. And then they take them off, and they observe the rat behavior as adult rats. And what do they find is that they are not curious, and they show a lot of anxiety. They tend not to mix as much with the others. And the male rats, they don't mount. In the words of the researchers, they're impaired in their copulatory functions. It's sort of the scientific term. But now they sacrifice those rats that have been exposed to SSRIs, and they find that their receptor densities are abnormally low, even though they've been off the drugs once they left puberty. So this is one of the ways, through PSSD, even after people come off, that they get this persistent sexual dysfunction. It's not limited to kids, by the way. You'll see it in adults too, somewhere around 20-25%. And then there's one other reason to worry about this. It comes from tardive dyskinesia. Have you all heard about tardive dyskinesia? Is that a phrase? Okay. So it arose in relationship to the first antipsychotics. So you put people on antipsychotics, Haldol, Thorazine, and people after a while start developing this persistent motor movement dysfunction. They might have a tongue that goes like this. It means they can't control their motor movement. You'll see a lot of jerky movements, that sort of thing. It's also a sign, by the way, of tardive dyskinesia is associated with cognitive decline. It's like a canary in the mine type thing for broader global dysfunction. Now you take a person with tardive dyskinesia, like a 35-year-old who's been on the drugs 10 years, you take them off, does the tardive dyskinesia go away? It doesn't, it persists. Now on autopsy, what do you find? You find that people with severe TD, it's associated with an increase in dopamine receptors caused by the drug. The more severe is actually associated with more of this elevation in D2 receptors. But at autopsy, even if they've come off, the D2 receptors haven't renormalized. So this is part of the worry that these things persist. Now I have to say, amongst many kids that get tardive dyskinesia, that are put on the antipsychotics, they come off it, they actually TD disappears. So there's some sign, I think, that sometimes, we don't really know, these receptor densities do renormalize. It's sort of a question out there. Maybe it happens sometimes, not other times. I don't know. Maybe it's a function of age. But do you see in this worry why this is such a big thing? We have 20% of our society on these drugs. This is happening, and we don't know what's happening long term. Yeah.
Do they test hormone levels like estrogen and those kinds of things? Do they see any rise in estrogen?
Well, the antipsychotics I know really change hormonal levels, dramatically so. That's like the atypical antipsychotics, Zyprexa, Risperdal, et cetera. So they do test that, and that's a problem with the antipsychotics. I don't know with the SSRIs. Maybe there's a panel tonight, and maybe Dr. Cousins knows this, or maybe Irving Kirsch. I don't know the effect of SSRIs on hormonal levels. I know doctors dealing, the few doctors dealing with PSSD, they're trying all sorts of things to try to like sort of push youth out of this, or 25-year-olds out of this sort of numbed out state, trying different strategies. I got 35 seconds here. So. Other questions? Oh, I don't, okay, she's asking what about SSRIs in the water supply? They do show up in the water supply now. I don't really know this, and I want to be really cautious and not say anything I really haven't read myself and dug into. I think there is some sign it maybe affects the fish a little bit, the levels, but I don't know. I don't really know. So I'm going to have to punt on that one because I don't know. But you do get measurable levels of antidepressants in certain water streams. Yeah.
Do you know anything about supplements like 5-HTP to precursor to serotonin, or how that?
So did you hear this answer? Do I know anything about supplements like 5-HTP as a treatment for depression, you're asking? Yeah. So the way I looked at this is, you remember when I started, I said like I had completely conventional beliefs? So really I have spent my whole time putting that conventional story, looking what science has to say about that conventional story. And what I'm quite sure is that conventional story that we're told that fuels our belief in psychiatric medication and our use of them, the chemical imbalance story, long-term outcomes, science is telling a different story about that mainstream care than what psychiatry is telling us. In some ways I have deliberately avoided thinking about going down alternatives, one, because this takes a lot of time, but here's why too. The minute you start saying that maybe a supplement is helpful, or whatever it might be, people say, see, he has an ideological bias. He's in favor of these supplements, the alternatives. No one can say that about me because I haven't investigated it. It really is this. All I've done is said, are you, the powers that be, telling us a true story about what you know about mental disorders, and are you being fully disclosing your worries about long-term course, the results from long-term courses, and what you see over and over again in those communications to the public is a story that is communicated that protects a market and a belief system, and unfortunately, even though science is undercutting it. But the answer to you is, in some ways, I protected myself from that criticism by saying I have no horse to ride. I have no alternatives horse to ride at all.
Do you see a similar negative strategy in marketing in the suppression of the endocannabinoid system by mainstream media, science, big business, pharma?
I don't know that story. Yeah, it sounds like a good story. I honestly don't know that particular story. I mean, I will be honest with you, I've spent a lot of time investigating this story. It really first happened when I was writing a book, Mad in America. That book was published in 2002. That upset some people. And my agent actually told me, said, because by this time I had left daily journalism, I was trying to make a living as a book writer, and my agent said, Bob, stay away from psychiatry. It's a mess. You'll get attacked. You'll lose your credibility. So actually I wrote another couple books outside of psychiatry for that reason. It's just too sort of perilous for a journalist to go down this path. But then people kept asking me, well, what about what's happening to the kids? What is happening to the anatomy? First book was just about severe mental illness. And so that's why I wrote anatomy. And then I ended up getting recruited into this lab to study institutional corruption, which is where the last book came from. So in some ways, it feels odd to be here. By that, I mean, I know so little about this sort of alternative universe and these other questions. I just don't know of it. Sort of a dunce in front of you.
It seems like everything you presented here, there's a total absence of any kind of nutritive investigation of what's missing, what's abundant, what's overabundant. And even in the fact that you said, they recover without the drugs and with the drugs, they don't say anything about therapy.
Right. So A couple of things here. One of these unmedicated versus medicated studies, the unmedicated group is just not taking drugs. They're not getting any support, right?
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's just ludicrous that they could even present themselves as being intelligent.
Well, that shows it's sort of like, what is the word for his? Well, they're not just the hubris, the incredible non-robustness of this research. So, in other words,
They're all depressed.
well, that may be it. But the point is, it's an impoverished, this is the word for it. It's not even comparing like drug versus people who get a nutrition element or a real exercise element. It's really drug versus leave them, they go off on their own way. So we don't even have the studies you're talking about about how about a good diet? Now, I personally know this. I haven't studied this. I will tell you this from personal experience. If I don't eat well for about 2 weeks, I start feeling pretty crappy. Right? We all know this. You don't sleep well, this sort of thing. What's that? And same thing with the lack of exercise. So this is isolating in a very isolated way the effects of drugs. And of course, we need now more attention, more research on diet, exercise, socialization. Like, I think one of the problems with people who get, quote, mentally ill is they get isolated from people. They get fearful of people. And no one does well isolated, or very few people do well in an isolated state. So one of the things you could do in addition to nutrition and exercise is how do you get people integrated into social situations? I know a guy in Connecticut, he runs a program. It's called Volunteers for Psychotherapy. And his deal is this: I'll give you 1 hour of free psychotherapy a week, an hour a week for free, provided you volunteer 2 hours per week. So now they have to go volunteer for homeless things or in dog shelters, that sort of thing. And here's what he says: I don't know if my psychotherapy is worth a damn, but I'm pretty sure the volunteer work is. And I agree with that. I mean, it's Rich Schulman. Rich Schulman, I think is what it is. In the back.
Well, I just wanted to make a comment. You mentioned that nobody or very little has been done in looking at the effect of dietary lifestyle changes on depression. We have a CHIP program that consists of 35 hours of intensive education and is a community-based program, so there's socialization there. Short-term effects, 71% recovery of depression. Short-term. So it's somewhat weak, but it's maybe something to be pursued.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should even give a caveat here is, there's certainly not pharmaceutical companies funding this sort of research into these, nutrition and environment, exercise, etc. The other problem we have is when the research is done on these things, it doesn't get promoted in the same way that drug research gets promoted for obvious reasons. So when I say there hasn't been done so much research, partially maybe I just don't know of it as well. But this is the sort of information I think we need to make known. The funny, and then I got to let you go. I mean, this is like preaching to a certain audience, of course. But in some ways, it's like common sense, right? That like if you eat well, you'll feel better, and if you exercise, you'll feel better, and that like if you watch TV all day and just eat crap, you're not going to feel good. My daughter, by the way, teaches in a high school in East New York. East New York is part of Brooklyn, okay? It's a very poor part of Brooklyn. She asks her kids, she's in a high school, what did you eat for breakfast? Now, what do you think those kids eat every day? Well, that would be a thing up. It's donuts and Coke or something like that. I mean, the diet is just horrific. So, yeah.
Depression is not a disease. I mean, if I had a child pass away and, it took me 2 years to kind of get normal, but I went to a place where people that had a prior experience to it enlightened me on what they went through, and that helped me tremendously. And there was a total absence of any of that saying, hey, it's normal, if you get hit by a car, you're going to be, kind of jerky when a car pulls out in front of you.
Right.
You know, it's just normal things.
Well, this is part of what's happened with ever since DSM-3. DSM-3 is that disease model. It absolutely is divorced from 2,000 years of medical history and literature and everything. Because of course we always used to know that depression and anxiety often arose in setbacks in life. Grief, you lose somebody, you lose a job. It was always understood that's not a biological problem. There was a real core thing called melancholy, where that sometimes came out of nowhere. People couldn't get out of bed. That was seen as a biological problem. But it was always understood that this depression in response to life events was normal. And DSM-3 broke with that tradition and said, we don't really care about what's happening in your life. And we now have this absurdity that if you're still grieving, I think it's 2 weeks after you lose a spouse or a child, you can get a clinical depression as if it's a brain disorder. And anybody who's read Shakespeare would say anybody who's not grieving after 2 weeks, that's the person with an abnormality. So anyway, thanks.
Well, I wonder if you ever heard of this mind control technology called Lilywave frequencies, mind control, alternating electromagnetics in the brain. They're all capable of doing something like that, and this is all for technology. What is it used for? I'm going to tell you what they claim, but I'm going to also share with the possibilities of what this thing can do. While the old-fashioned techniques through MK Ultra and such were using electrodes and stimulants, direct stimulants and trauma-based, they're no longer necessary to reach the target, because the target now can be electronically reached through frequencies that can manipulate the brain's water molecules, essentially changing the way the person feels or reacts. And this technology that I'm talking about, the Lilywave, was developed by Dr. John C. Lilly during the time at the U.S. National Institute of Health. And in the course of his work, Lilly discovered that a certain form of wavelength could manipulate the water molecules with the subject's brain, which could essentially change the way they think or feel. And supposedly, this is helpful in healing properties and stimulating the brain in order to react a certain way to receive suggestions. And according to another innovator, Patrick Flanagan, the technology used in these things can utilize using frequency waves of 40 hertz, and it did not require the use of electrodes. Flanagan claimed that the U.S. government had immediately decided to weaponize the technology as soon as they developed it. So in other words, the government has this capability in their hands, and they're using it for weaponry purposes. I'm going to get into some examples of this in a second. But going on with what I wrote about this experiment, I mentioned the other startling experiments using electromagnetic frequencies for manipulation through television monitors. Yes, television monitors are using refresh rates and frequencies that they were developing into mind control patents. And the inventor, Hendrikus Luce, called his invention the nervous system manipulation by electromagnetic fields from monitors. Patent 6506148B2 is capable of this. This patent states that the invention can alter a human's emotional state by altering the electromagnetic fields around them using devices such as television screens, computer monitors, and we know now cell phones and other things. And Luce wrote that it is therefore possible to manipulate the nervous system by a subject by pulling images displayed on a nearby computer monitor, or TV set. Perhaps the most sinister aspect of this invention is that it can be used without the subject of the mind control ever being aware that it's happening. And we wonder why television is so seductive and so sedative that in an instant of 5 seconds or so, one is entranced in it, and it hypnotizes a person to the screen to get involved into the storyline. And this is done by altering the alpha waves of the brain and basically distracting it by sending it subconscious messages, while at the same time sending the conscious levels of the brain images and pictures to distract it, so that all the alpha waves can actually sedate the mind in order to open it up for subliminal messages. You wonder if this is dangerous and if this is being used. I can tell you it is. Subliminal messages in television has been used since its inception, and they were putting them even in the sign-off. Remember the what was it, the Pledge of Allegiance or whatever they had at the end of the sign-off day at the night. They had subliminal messages in that. They backed away from it since the public were becoming aware and people were having sort of reactions from it. But there's other techniques that have been exposed ever since, such as brain mapping technology, which is said to be a priority for the controllers of the Davos network, according to the team, a team at TruthStream Media that investigated. This technology is capable of decoding the human brain. Essentially, this will mean that it will give the users power to read the thoughts of other people. They're working on this technology. This is not far-fetched because Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, media, social media, the platform there, has admitted that he is working with members of DARPA on mind thought reading in order to integrate it into the computers so that a person only merely has to think about the keystrokes and the computer will react. These technologies in the U.S. government was exposed by Dr. Robert Duncan, formerly of the CIA, who claimed that the U.S. Army used a sinister mind control technology during the Iraqi war, which bears the name the Voice of God. According to Duncan, the technology piped voices into the brains of the enemy combatants and urged or commanded them to drop their weapons and surrender to the Americans. While we did not say which organization was responsible for creating this potentially incredible, dangerous invention, many suspect that it was created by DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. DARPA is a private agency, but they work closely with contracts for the government for developing everything from mind control technology to brain waving, mapping, data mining collections, astral projection. They're involved in the occult, which is they admitted that they're in the field of technology of mind control for the military complex. Also, though, Bob, I got a link here that I kind of looked into this guy. I mentioned, did I mention him, Flanagan? Yeah, I did. Patrick Flanagan, in the 60s, I think it was. He was, let's see, where is it? I had it up here. Flanagan was involved as much as an innovator of this frequency technology, using the vibration technology, which allows transmission of sounds through the skin. Oh, let me tell you about the device first. This device is patent number 31709993. It's means for aiding hearing by electrical stimulation of the facial nerve system. And this is a transmitter, a transmission of electronics, and it supposedly is able of sending vibration technology of sound vibrations through the skin as it was a speaker. and bypassing the brain and the ear to hear it by going through the vibrations of the skin, allowing parts of the brain to process it, creating new neutral airwaves. I've seen a demonstration of this by the late Dr. Stanley Monteith, and I am actually in contact with an associate of his, so I do have a connection to him. But he showed this technology on how you can just basically, he did a short-term one where he just applied it to the body, but through the body, the recipient was fascinated as he thought he could hear the voices coming from his own brain when all it was doing was vibrating off the skin. This technology is incredible, but this is what they're capable of. But what I was getting at is this Flanagan guy, Bob. He was involved in ancient Egyptian sacred geometry and what's called pyramidology. He studied pyramids and also Sri-Yantra, which is a mystic calculations, esoteric calculations, occultism, and he formulated a diagram, developed a diagram to read this occult formula pattern. So Flanagan was actually involved in the occult. I think his device is called the Neurophone. I think that was his. But anyway, yeah, he was we wonder where these people get these ideas, but, wouldn't it be something if they were channeled from the ancient, Nephilim or the ancient technicians that were of old in the antediluvian era? And they, these people are, Tesla has been known to channel, that they were channeling these spirits to get this technology. It's incredible how this technology is well advanced past human beings, and they're just basically going by formulas and by schematics that they seem to have accidentally come across, and now they're developing these technologies for the U.S. government and for weaponry and all this other stuff. It kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it, Bob?
Well, Jim, if you just look at some of the technology that's available, there's a YouTube video where a guy suspends stuff in air with different sound waves.
Oh, yeah.
Kind of using it in a creative art type of way. There's some things that can clean clothing and stuff with sound waves, so it vibrates the fabric or the whatever the dirt material is, and that can come off. Police departments have some riot control guns that can make you lose bowel and bladder control when they do it. A singer can shatter glass with the frequency. Kids will try to mimic certain sounds, and when they hit the harmonic with it, they can feel their own body kind of like shake and vibrate. So if you think about it, Carl Jung says that psychology is a manipulation of the soul. So if you can do stuff with certain frequencies, why not vibrate somebody's brain? They can hit a certain area and make your little finger move or whatever, and then they move it a little bit and then go and hit an area that's supposed to relieve depression. So you take these type of things that's already out there, nothing else is too far-fetched. So the idea of, you're getting people into some type of, called the mind control witchcraft, that's similar to, like demonic possession. The idea of putting your thoughts into someone else's head is pretty close to possession, to control people. Now you put them on some type of psych drug, whether it's antidepressants or some type of narcotic. You flash the TV screen at a certain rate, you mesmerize them. Whatever they see is what they believe. If you really start pinning people down to their opinions, they get it, from TV or music, and that's where they usually get their political or their religious opinions from somebody else's input.
Tila Tequila, I'm not familiar with her. I guess she was on MTV. She's some kind of actress or whatever. It's not important. But she came out and spoke against the industry. And before she had a brain aneurysm right after she spoke, and went into a hospital and then into rehab and came out and wasn't the same afterwards. She's now starting to speak out a little bit from the last time I've heard, but she's kind of got right off the scene. But she was speaking on how the industry uses Kabbalah mind control techniques and programming, and she spoke against the industry for using audible frequencies in the songs in high frequency ranges that affect the human being and puts messages into the human being through the inaudible frequencies of the songs. So while you're hearing, your brain is consciously being distracted, subconsciously it's being altered by these frequencies. I mean, think about it. How easy would it be for them to use television or audio or sounds to manipulate us?
Very easy, Jim. Disco music, I think it was 138, might have been 136 beats per second, mimics the infant heartbeat inside a woman. That's why disco appealed to so many women. And it was kind of like an intentional thing that would make them more apt to sin. Now, there was what we used to call head music, I guess Pink Floyd would be probably the most famous group, but some of the music would play with someone's mind. You'd hear the expression, expand your mind. People would want to get stoned and listen to different music for what it would do. Sometimes it would be creepy and scary. Sometimes it would make your mind wander and go off somewhere else. And they could actually, with a little bit of sorcery, which would be, like the drugs, and with the music, could take your mind to different places, make people feel a certain way. And, people of my generation know that. But when it comes to thinking a government would try to do that, or some corporations, it already happened with the musicians, but people don't want to believe that something bigger than, a little band could do the same thing.
Dr. Nick Begich, Jr., Executive Director of Lay Institute on Technology, he authored a book several years ago called Angels Don't Play This HAARP, talking about the HAARP technology, HAARP, and I don't remember what it all stands for, hyper atmospheric something or other. This installation, I think one of them is in Alaska, has been known to successfully isolate healing frequency codes in the human body. And at the same time, this knowledge has been pursued by DARPA. Who's NARPA? DARPA research into brain decoding and the development of electronic micro and nano circuits that will directly interact with the brain. And new microchip technology could be used to direct interaction between the brains of people and computers. The HAARP installation may be a weapon to stimulate the ionosphere to return a pulsed electromagnetic signal which can override normal brain functions. And what we do know about this HAARP is it's been suspected of causing weather conditions, controlled weather conditions, in which it can send frequencies into the atmosphere and push clouds or condense areas or whatever is the subject of their experiment, and they can cause a drought in an area, or they can cause overflooding in an area. And some had been suspected them to be tampering with their area once they revealed something that in their region, in their county, they had tremendous downpours or tornadoes after they mentioned a couple things, and they were wondering if HAARP was a part of this. I do know that there are people that are suspicious of HAARP that know of this technology on how it can target individuals, and there were some that suspected this I don't have any examples at hand that I want to bring up, but this technology is all part of the same electromagnetic frequencies that we're talking about that can control the atmosphere. We know these things are possible. There was experiments by Jose Delgado in the 1960s on how he used the frequency to stimulate a bull by a push of a button through electromagnetic frequencies. We're now told that electromagnetic frequencies can isolate a certain part of the brain for fundamental thinking. They can isolate out the God-believing part of the brain. Apparently squash our fundamental belief in God, or at least stimulate it.
Well, a lot of people seem to be indifferent. They used to get mad, or they'd get maybe convicted but put it off, or they'd repent and accept Christ. Well, here's the thing. If you can stimulate something like water in the air so then it gathers together, drops down, and rains, or a kid hasn't put a fly in a microwave to watch it spark and explode. Microwaves can cook meat. You put an egg in there, it will explode. So you send a high frequency through somebody. You can heat up food. Why not heat up someone's blood through their brain and cause a stroke? You could do it with a computer or cell phone, something like that. You got all this metal in your food, anything aluminum. You got your aluminum oxide, aluminum this, that, and the other thing in your ingredients. When metals accumulate in the brain, why not vibrate the metals? That will do some damage in somebody's brain.
Yeah,
and then, of course, manipulating the waves themselves. This is scary technology.
Yeah, you've mentioned the Gwen towers before. Want to tie that into what you're talking about, because you're microwaving and all that. You're talking about the same thing, those EMF cell towers.
Okay. People, when you go through an area that's kind of congested with traffic, and if you start noticing there's an area where everybody has trouble staying in the lines for maybe, an eighth of a mile, quarter-mile stretch of road, or in a certain curve where it happens, look for the towers, little cell phone towers. Sometimes they're even disguised like trees.
Yeah, there has been several people that have been complaining when they got in an accident in those areas, complaining that they had a disabling thought, disorientation, causing illness. They were blinded for a second. All these things happen. Dizziness, waves of dizziness, unexplained depression people are talking about, moments of confusion. Is this the effects of electronic frequency weaponry?
Or a little blank out. They might be sending different signals and using the police and accident reports to monitor the data. You want your test results. They don't care. Humans are useless eaters. We're guinea pigs, only there to serve the elite.
Yeah.
This stuff we were raised on cartoons, people are trying to do it now. But we treat it like something we saw on a cartoon. We just kind of wink at it. And we get so much stimulation from the TV and the media and all this stuff thrown at us. And then all these different plots that are coming together, there's so many, it's kind of overwhelming.
Brian.